After hearing Echo's speech, all those below fell silent, unable to believe their ears for a moment. Tulamu was equally shocked. At the same time, he finally understood the true purpose of why Axe and others had come all the way here. He finally understood what Axe was saying when he said that there would be a new oasis and new orders. Regardless, no one wanted to fight and kill each other for resources on this land. Having a piece of evergreen land was the dream of all Majin people. The chief of the Blackwater clan suddenly realized something, and immediately stood up to refute, shouting that it was all lies and deceit. He brought up the Blackbone and Sandstone clans again, who had met their demise after naively believing the words of Garcia. Clearly, he wanted everyone here to believe that those northerners would offer them a small piece of land, where they would still have to fight each other for territory, and that the king would continue to exploit them. Hearing this, Tulamu let out a sigh, while shaking his head, thinking that if it was before the sacred duel, these words could have an immense effect on the people here. However, when he looked around, it appeared that everyone was discussing. However, no one paid attention to the words of the Blackwater clan chief. After all, with 5 duels and no deaths, the merciful image of the Asha clan had already spread throughout the entire southern territory. It wasn't difficult for people to realize that the king behind the opposition was equally benevolent and merciful. Many people began to waver, as, being from small clans, they could only keep fighting and barely surviving here. So why not try their luck in the north? Echo walked behind the Blackwater clan chief, telling him he was wrong. Pointing out that Garcia needed mercenaries, not citizens, and that was the biggest difference between Garcia and King Roland. That was also why she chose the powerful Blackbone and Sandstone clans known for their combat strength. But King Roland was different. He saw all Majin people as his people, regardless of the size of the clan, how powerful they were, or how many males they had. In fact, Roland didn't need any of the Sand people to fight for him. After all, any benevolent king would not sit by and watch his people die needlessly. At that moment, the leader of the first clan stood up, questioning what price they needed to pay. He didn't believe in the existence of unreciprocated grace in this world. He seemed hesitant, but ultimately, he gritted his teeth and asked Echo to tell him the cost, ready to accept whatever it was. Echo calmly replied that it was simple: work. Just like the citizens in Grey Castle, work for the kingdom and work for themselves. Earn a salary, improve their living conditions, receive education, and raise offspring. This was all Roland wished to see. Hearing this, everyone fell silent again. They all wondered the same thing: that's all the king is asking for? Did they no longer need to fight and kill each other and struggle to survive? In this endless desert, as oases turned to sand, the places where they once called home began to shrink, and resources became more sacred. Perhaps it wouldn't be long before everyone would be buried by the expanding desert. Echo looked at the crowd again, questioning if they intended to keep fighting and dueling for survival, soaking the sands with blood, only to eventually disappear with the oasis in the far south. Was that the outcome they were willing to accept? From the cries of the people below, it was clear they didn't want to continue living like this. Looking at the woman on the stage, who had captured everyone's attention, a tear rolled down Axe's face. He kneeled on one knee, so happy that he finally witnessing this day. Echo assured them once more that the truth would prove everything. One middle-aged man below the stage kneeled, placing his hand on his chest. Soon, more people knelt down one after another, cheering for Echo and bowing to salute the birth of the great chieftain Roland. The witches smiled at the scene, and through the communication imprint held by Hummingbird, Roland too heard the deafening cheers. Roland listened to all this with emotion, thinking that they had finally taken the first step. However, this was just the beginning. There was much more to be done. Looking at the 3 young witches in front of him, Roland needed them to head to Iron Sand City immediately to treat Lorca. They were to set off tonight and were expected to arrive at Dragon Fall Ridge to rest for the night and arrive in Iron Sand City the following day. Lightning pointed to herself and Maisie, asking if both needed to go. Roland smiled and said that Maisie alone wouldn't be able to strap Nanoa onto her back. He then advised them to dress warmly, as flying in this weather was no easy task. Nanoa looked out at the falling snow and suddenly realized she would likely be strapped to Maisie's back, causing her to shiver at the thought. Maisie raised her hand, assuring that she would arrive on time. Lightning, a bit disheartened, thought she would be left out of the exploration, pled Roland not to explore the snowy mountains before she returned. She didn't want to miss such a grand adventure, otherwise she would be super upset. Roland couldn't help but laugh at the thought of the greatest adventurer crying. However, he promised that he would wait for their return then to have them join him in the exploration. A few hours passed. After a day's work, Roland arrived at the third border town. This isn't exactly a town, rather. This was an underground bunker hollowed out at the foot of the mountain, with a massive iron gate towering tens of meters tall, with watchtowers at its four corners topped with barbed wire, and two machine gun bunkers standing imposingly at the entrance. To construct it, it had nearly spent a third of Neverwinter's entire winter steel production, but he was confident that this fortress could withstand any demonic beast. The group entered the bunker, and the light dimmed in soon. They were engulfed in complete darkness. Phyllis took out a glowing magic stone and led the way. As they walked, Wendy curiously asked why Roland called this place the third border town. If the outside border town district was considered the first, then where was the second? Roland smiled and asked Wendy if she didn't think the ordinal number third matched the fortress wall. Wendy, seeing Roland start to talk about odd things again, shrugged while saying as long as Roland liked it she was fine. She then walked over to Phyllis and told her that His Majesty often said strange things, advising her not to mind it. The group continued forward. Phyllis slowed her pace and was about to ask Roland something, but clearly, Roland already knew what she wanted to ask without her finishing her sentence. Roland simply asked Phyllis to take him inside. As they reached the deepest part, a spacious arched hall appeared before them, with three tentacled creatures, or rather, the original carriers, standing in the middle of the hall, surrounded by witches who had become part of the God Punishment army. He walked towards the three Takira witches with a smile, extending his right hand to the leading tentacled creature. Nightingale, in the mist, looked a bit tense, her hand already on his shoulder, ready to pull him into the mist at any sign of danger. The tentacled creature was silent for a moment, then its voice resonated in his mind. Pasha was quite surprised by Roland, as their previous conversations were through screens, and Roland's composure now was almost unthinkable. Even the Takira witches were not as composed as Roland when they first saw the unused original carriers. Nonetheless, the creature extended a tentacle to shake hands with Roland. The first to speak was Pasha, who first acknowledged Roland's support for the Takira witches. Suddenly, another voice intervened, saying that just sending an army squad to escort a relic was not much support but rather monitoring and supervision. This voice was Alethea's. However, a third voice, Celine's, interrupted, asking Alethea not to speak recklessly. Roland didn't mind their tone, smiling and saying that fear comes from the unknown, and regardless of their current form, they were still the Takira witches from the heart. As for the Takira witches, he was familiar with them, as Agatha had become an indispensable part of the witch union. It was almost as if he could see Pasha standing before him, and Pasha's voice seemed somewhat emotional. Her opinion of Roland significantly improved. Roland hoped that everyone would set aside prejudices under the threat of the demons. After the pleasantries, Roland turned to the main topic. It was time to see the so-called relic. Pasha then directed Roland's attention to the massive cube behind them. Nightingale whispered in his ear that it was the stone of God's punishment, and she couldn't get too close. The wrapping was necessary to limit the relic's summoning range. Without the layers of the stone of God's punishment, the entirety of Neverwinter might be affected by the relic. Before Roland could touch it, they needed to explain some things to prevent any accidents. Hearing the potential danger, Wendy instinctively stepped forward to shield Roland. Celine assured Wendy not to worry, as long as no one was alone with the relic. Roland looked at Celine, puzzled, asking what she meant. It turned out that when one's guard was down in front of the relic, they would be summoned into a world where they could see some incredible scenes, accessible to both witches and ordinary people. However, these were not fabrications. At this point, Pasha became serious, warning Roland to never be summoned by the relic alone. It was essential to have people around him, since the contents of the painting could affect reality. The idea that the scenes from the painting could influence reality sent shivers down Roland's spine, suddenly recalling the scene of Sadako crawling out of the TV. Turned out, once summoned, the person cannot control his own body in the outside world, and at that moment, someone needed to be there to pull the person out of the relic's range. However, the ancient texts also mention cases where souls couldn't return to their bodies after touching the relic alone. The risk was lower if multiple people took turns making contact. Regarding the second point, Aletheia tells him that some paintings inside were from other civilizations, and those things would definitely try to harm Roland. Although others could pull him out of the range, they couldn't help him resist the fear. Hearing this, Roland was unfazed, smiled, and asked if there was anything else they should mention. Aletheia probably didn't expect him to be so calm and couldn't think of anything else to say. Roland sighed internally. As a modern person accustomed to all sorts of monsters, aliens, thrillers, and horror movies, he believed he was more tolerant than someone from this era. As long as it wouldn't cause real harm, he didn't think he would give up exploring the mysteries of the gods due to such a level of intimidation. When Roland was ready, Pasha opened the cube wrapping the relic, causing the relic float in the air. Wendy, somewhat worried, grabbed Roland's arm. Roland patted Wendy's hand, reassuring her not to worry, and smilingly said that with everyone present, he wouldn't be in danger. Then he took a few steps forward and sat down cross-legged next to the relic, closing his eyes. Meanwhile, Pasha and the others spoke words only they could hear. Aletheia grumbled that Roland was too arrogant and would surely be trembling with fear, suggesting they all mock him then. Celine gave her an annoyed glance, stating that ridiculing him would benefit no one. Mortal kings care a lot about their dignity and prestige, causing him to be embarrassed might make them bear his grudge. Worse still, if he developed a deep-seated fear of the demon, it could spell doom for the world. Pasha dismissively said they had issued all the warnings they couldn't possibly stop Roland now. Celine sighed, thinking it was a mistake to let Roland interact with the relic in the first place. Pasha shook her head, arguing that if they kept deceiving Roland and preventing him do so, they would never gain his trust. After all, some things can only be understood through personal experience. Celine wanted to say more but was interrupted by Pasha, who noted that the demons and eyeballs in the painting didn't always appear. Even if Roland got frightened this time, as long as they kept it a secret, no one else would know. Whether the witches around Roland would keep this secret was beyond their control. When Roland opened his eyes again, he found himself in an unknown space, just as the Takira witches had described. Around him were 4 large paintings. Roland slowly stood up, thinking that after experiencing many vivid and exaggerated dream worlds, few scenes could scare him now. He looked around. The first painting's chair had no demon sitting on it, and there was nothing strange in the deep-sea painting. Observing the other paintings, Roland realized that the relic might be a recorder of some sort, providing real-time feedback on the scenery around him. Looking at the only black painting, it seemed this represented the underground civilization that was eliminated. The fourth painting depicted the hall where Roland had been before. Roland greeted his own image and Wendy's in the painting, but it seemed they couldn't hear him. He shrugged, wondering where was the effect on reality. Then he began to try touching the paintings, but suddenly, there was a noise from the painting behind him. He felt a chill run through his body. He hadn't expected these paintings to have sound. Turning around, he saw that in the painting showing the throne, a black armored knight with a giant sword was now looking toward Roland, and another painting featured a giant creepy eyeball. Roland looked at these 2 paintings with some surprise, half-jokingly thinking they seemed to have coordinated to meet him here. He looked up and walked to the center of the 4 giant paintings, facing the creatures from 2 civilizations. He asked if they too had come to participate in the divine war, however, he received no response. Nonetheless, Roland kept talking, expressing he didn't want to fight if possible and suggesting that we all sit down and have a conversation instead. He tried to communicate with them but again, got no response, which was somewhat frustrating for Roland. Suddenly, he thought he saw the demon's chest heaving more rapidly, and the giant eyeball trembling. He jokingly thought it was a side effect of a staring contest. Although there was no danger, it was still quite strange. Just then, numerous giant tentacles appeared. We returned to the underground bunker, where the Takira witches waiting outside thought Roland hadn't seen anything because Roland didn't seem to be affected. Aletheia suggested they guess how long Roland could stay inside. Celine found it boring but still remarked that the best Takira witches who had experienced battlefields and fought demons often lasted longer inside, citing Acaris who had set a record by staying a whole hour. Celine was indeed curious about how long Roland could stay inside, but she also worried that the longer he stayed, the more likely he was to become dizzy or even faint. Suddenly turning around, Celine asked Pasha if she had failed to mention this point. Pasha wasn't too concerned, believing that fainting wouldn't cause Roland to feel embarrassed and wouldn't cause any harm either, and it would reduce Roland's impulse to interact with the relic in the future, which she thought was good for everyone. It turned out Pasha hadn't forgotten, she had intentionally omitted this detail. After all, many people wouldn't appreciate being told everything, and certainly, preventing someone from exploring and connecting with the gods would provoke resentment. Alethea commented, now understanding why Pasha was the Federation's top 3-seat substitute. Hearing this, Celine felt the same. Compared to being terrified of losing one's composure, fainting from exhaustion could be seen as an exit without side effects. It could curb Roland's curiosity without damaging relations between the two sides. Clearly, Pasha had thought further ahead than both of them. After a while, nearly 30 minutes had passed since Roland interacted with the relic, but there seemed to be no abnormalities. Alethea was curious, suggesting they might witness a new record. Another 30 minutes have passed by. Celine, however, was uneasy, looking at Wendy standing there anxiously. She wondered if an unprecedented accident might occur. At the same time, Nightingale was actually talking to Wendy in the mist, both of them very concerned. After a few minutes, they both decided to act. Wendy couldn't help but step forward, seemingly wanting to wake the king, but was stopped by Pasha, who worried that Wendy too would be affected by the relic. Wendy insisted on going in to bring Roland out, but Pasha told her that what each person saw was unique, and even if she went in, she couldn't bring back the king. Seeing Wendy being stopped, Nightingale thought the Takira witches were up to something. Worried about Roland's well-being, she emerged from the mist, a revolver in hand, pointed at the 3 Takira witches, her finger already on the trigger, ready to shoot at any moment. The 3 of them were startled, clearly knowing the power of the firearms. Without hesitation, they all prepared to forcefully pull Roland back. Pasha extended her tentacles to wrap around Roland, pulling him back to Wendy's side. Then the others immediately covered the cube again. Suddenly, Roland's eyes snapped open. The first thing he saw was 2 huge pairs, boing boings. Wendy helped him stand up, asking anxiously how he felt. Roland's legs were a bit numb from sitting for so long, but other than that, he didn't feel any discomfort. He recounted what he had seen, like the eyeball and the armored knight in the paintings. He tried to communicate, but it seemed they couldn't understand him. The Takira witches were astonished. They didn't expect Roland to have encountered the demon and the giant eyeball. They exchanged glances, surprised that Roland could face the demon and the enemy from another civilization and still hold on for so long. Pasha inquired what happened next. Roland recalled how suddenly some black tentacles appeared and attacked them, wrapping around their bodies. The demon was struggling to break free, then used fire and sword to cut off the tentacles. The demon was clearly injured and fled immediately after breaking free. As for the giant eyeball, several tentacles had pierced into it, but suddenly a blinding light burst from the eyeball, and some blue liquid flowed out, but it too managed to break free and then fled, apparently also severely injured. Roland wasn't attacked, but looked inexplicably at the 2 paintings and shrugged, thinking, is that the end of it? To put it simply, the tentacles were very strong, and the demon and the eyeball had no choice but to flee. The Takira witches were not surprised by the appearance of the black tentacles, because many had witnessed the same thing, and all had been attacked by the tentacles. However, they also knew that as the person's stamina continuously depleted, the relic's influence on the person would grow stronger. Of course, resisting such mental erosion is not something ordinary people can manage. Even battle-hardened witches would quickly feel fatigued and eventually lose control over their bodies. However, why was Roland's experience entirely the opposite, with even the black tentacles rushing toward the enemy instead and ignoring him? This was the first time they had heard of such a thing. As for Roland encountering the 2 what they called guardians from 2 other civilizations, not only was he unharmed, but he also managed to repel them. The witches suddenly had an incredible thought. Could this mean that this mortal king's mental strength be on par with that of the strongest of the 3 seats, the Starfall Queen, Acarus? They discussed among themselves, a discussion Roland naturally couldn't hear, but he still thanked them for pulling him back. After the demon and the eyeball disappeared, he just kept walking, trying to see if there was a boundary or a limit to the world, but the further he went, the more relieved he was to be pulled back, otherwise, he would have had to return the same way. After a long silence, Pasha asked if Roland wanted to continue exploring the relic. Roland shook his head. He had temporarily lost interest in the 4 paintings. What he wanted to see now was the central carrier. When Roland saw the central carrier with his own eyes, he couldn't help but inhale sharply. It was like a massive tumor, a fusion of over a dozen Takira witch souls, which had sacrificed their sanity to gain the ability to decipher the documents left by the underground civilization. The carrier had 3 giant tentacles, however they were pinned on the ground by giant nails. Not only that, the body of the center carrier was wrapped tightly in layers of iron chains and seemed to have suffered many injuries from it. Roland frowned, asking the 3 witches why this was necessary, especially since the carrier was pretty much made out of witches, including one of their own from the top 3 seats. Pasha sighed and explained that the power possessed by the carrier was not much weaker than that of the gods' punishment warriors. If they didn't do this, an unconscious carrier that could move freely might cause more trouble than the demonic beasts. Roland pointed out that the witches who voluntarily fused with the carrier had given everything to Takira and were now trapped in this dark corner, unable to move. This was unfair to them. Pasha understood Roland's point, her voice tinged with bitterness. Although they had tried to ask the witches inside the carrier about their feelings, they got no response. Aletheia was also moved by Roland's words, realizing that he truly cared about the witches' feelings. She reassured Roland not to worry. As for all the Takira witches here, merging with Lady Eleanor was the ultimate destiny for every Takira witch. It turned out that when they asked whether the central carrier should be restrained, all the answers from the 3 main tentacles were yes. Otherwise, they wouldn't have secured her so thoroughly. Roland nodded, then mentioned that the witch union had 2 witches, Soroya who could draw extremely flexible fabrics, and Shadow Feather who could make objects sticky. Perhaps they could create something to stop the carrier from moving around while preventing further injuries and making it feel more comfortable. The witches were grateful for Roland's suggestion and bowed in thanks. Then he approached the central carrier and asked his question. It was a simple 1-digit addition question. When he asked if the answer he gave was right, the 3 tentacles lit up instantly, meaning yes. Surprising the Takira witches who didn't expect Roland to ask such a question. Roland explained it was just a test. Then he took out a paper, asking if he had 12,345 baskets, each containing 54,321 apples, how many apples would there be if they were all poured out? Roland gave the answer, a 9-digit number, quite a complex problem for that era, and asked if it was correct. As soon as he stated the number, the 3 tentacles' lights lit up again, just like before. The response was immediate, without any delay. It turned out that the central carrier could indeed calculate the answer and did so instantaneously. Even if it could only respond with yes or no, Roland thought this was of great help to the arithmetic department. At the very least, it could be used to verify results, reducing the error rate in large and complex calculations. Roland was delighted, crouching down and patting the main tentacle, complimenting how great she was. Pasha reminded him that the carrier couldn't communicate with Roland. Roland, however, believed that if it could understand his words and respond with yes or no, this was already a form of communication. He then suggested trying to see if it could express more than just affirmative or negative responses. He told the carrier to treat one glowing tentacle as 1, 2 as 2, and so on. His question was if the carrier could use a red light to represent the number 3. This wasn't a math question but held significant meaning. However, the central carrier did not respond immediately as before. After a few moments, one tentacle lit up with red light, another emitted a faint glow, and the last one did not light up. Pasha sighed, saying that Roland's question exceeded its capabilities. Turned out, they had tried before to make it express simple concepts, but once it went beyond simple right or wrong judgments, its response time would significantly slow down, and it could easily become confused as it did just now. Roland understood that this was a logical impediment. He then asked, worriedly, if this was okay for the carrier. Celine explained that it just needed some rest to recover. With the day's work done, Roland prepared to leave, thinking that it seemed biological computers weren't so easy to handle after all. Perhaps they needed to find a method that could answer with yes or no and also perform complex expressions. As for what to do next, they would have to wait until after the Snowy Mountain exploration was completed and a basic trust was established between the two parties. He stretched, feeling satisfied with the day's work. Looking at the majestic third border town, far from finished, he envisioned that once the entire mountain was fully connected, it would become a real fortress, integrated with the surface artillery and camps, and forming part of the most powerful defensive line. Not long after, Roland returned to the castle and immediately called over the heads of several departments of the city hall. Under the astonished gazes of those present, it was their first time seeing the tentacle creatures, aka the ancient Takira witches. Despite having been forewarned, the sight of these tentacled creatures made everyone gasp in shock. Some spilled their tea, some stood up, and some even thought of leaving the hall. Edith was the only one who could be considered calm. There was a mix of excitement and curiosity in her eyes, and Roland also noticed the way Edith looked at him was a bit weird. He had no idea why her face was blushing, perhaps excited seeing tentacles. Nonetheless, he shook off the thoughts. Given the upcoming battle against demons, Roland naturally had to inform everyone of the Takira witches' existence. He then began to introduce their origin and their stories. It seemed like, after more than 2 years of experience, all of Roland's officials and their ability to accept new things should have greatly improved. As he thought. But just as Roland finished explaining and shared the plan to explore the Snowy Mountains, Barav was the first to speak up. His finance department was entering the year-end closing stage, making it inconvenient to plan new logistics. He also pointed out that with the month of the demons not over yet, and a portion of the First Army currently stationed in the far south, sending troops to the Snowy Mountains could lead to insufficient defensive forces in the borders. Carter was second to speak. "Oh Lord, this is our handsome Chief Knight Carter. The new artist surely did him dirty." Anyway, he expressed his concerns about the plan's reliability. Clearly, he held some skepticism against the Takira witches. The agriculture minister then spoke and mentioned that mobilizing now could strain their food reserves. The Minister of Construction, Carl, worried that the Takira witches' excavations at the foot of the northern mountains could destabilize the mines and cause collapses. Everyone expressed their concerns, which all boiled down to advising Roland to reconsider his plan. This left Roland somewhat disappointed, as it seemed like his plan would be hard to continue if it were up to a council discussion. Although Roland usually prefers a democratic approach, however, on certain matters, he doesn't forget that he is the ultimate decision-maker. In times like these, it was up to him to assertively push forward the implementation of the plan. Just as he decisively decided to shelter the witches years ago. Roland tapped the table, and the hall instantly fell silent. He declared that the next year would be the most important year for Grey Castle, as he intended to unify the entire territory and hold a coronation ceremony to officially become the king of Grey Castle. He tells them that everyone present here would become his first cabinet ministers, assisting him in governing the kingdom. Upon hearing this, everyone stood up, placed their right hand over their chest, bowed in respect, and finally understood their king's intentions. They stopped complaining, and the fear they once had about the demons and Takira witches had dissipated completely. To everyone here, for they knew their king had always led them to victory, and have never been wrong. To even have the thought of hindering the king's plan because of their own fear is embarrassing. After a moment, the discussion resumed. Carter suggested that they should only send the First Army and the Witch Union into the Snowy Mountains first. Roland interrupted him, pointing out the absence of light and the complexity of the terrain, which would render firearms ineffective. Encountering powerful mixed-breed demonic beasts in close range would undoubtedly lead to heavy casualties for the First Army. Carter was left speechless. He totally didn't think of this. Roland continued, explaining that this was precisely why they needed to collaborate with the Takira witches on the exploration. The God's Punishment witches and the Witch Union could complement each other perfectly. The First Army would be responsible for covering their rear and establishing outposts at explored passageways to ensure a clear retreat path. Roland emphasized that this was the most prudent approach. However, Roland paused, then raised his voice to make sure everyone understood. He did not want to hear about how difficult implementing this plan would be because everyone here was sitting there precisely to solve these difficulties. At this point, Roland's demeanor became serious. With the Third Divine War looming, he he emphasized the need for capable ministers and officials. He then turned to Barav, who stood up abruptly, visibly startled. When asked if there were any issues with the financial settlements and logistics, Barav claimed he could have a plan ready in 5 days. Roland, however, shook his head and gave him only 3 days. He then directed the Minister of Agriculture to ensure the food supply was prepared, and if it wasn't sufficient, he tells him to send ships to Canggu district to acquire more. Addressing Karl, before Roland even said anything, he proactively assured he would thoroughly inspect the geological stability of the mining areas and furnaces to prevent collapses. Roland nodded in approval and proceeded to assign tasks to everyone else. After discussing the plan, Roland asked Edith to recap the arrangements. Edith stood up. For this mission, Takira would dispatch 50 gods' punishment witches to fight alongside the Witch Union. The First Army, under the command of Brian, would select 500 of their best soldiers, while the rest would remain stationed in Neverwinter under Carter's command. With consensus reached on the exploration plan, Roland was about to conclude the meeting when Edith stood up, requesting to join the expedition to the Snowy Mountains. Barav, sitting next to him, remarked that she was neither a witch nor a soldier. She didn't need to be on the mission. However, Edith countered by stating she was a knight and had served as a swordsmanship instructor, capable of defending herself. Roland inquired about her reason for applying. Edith believed that with the divine war drawing closer, most of the ministers probably didn't even know what demons look like. If one did not even know the enemy, it would be impossible to assist the king in managing the city hall effectively. She thinks that with the Great War approaching, everyone needed to prepare for battle. Barav wanted to object but found himself at a loss for words. Clearly everything Edith said was right. Roland smiled, finding the argument interesting. Suddenly, he had an idea. What if this became a standard rule, where advancement for power required frontline experience as a prerequisite for promotion? This could ensure that City Hall officials would not underestimate their enemy and the war. Moreover, Edith possesses a talent for combat. With this in mind, Roland agreed to Edith's proposal. Edith played with her hair, smiling and bowing in gratitude. Back at the apartment, Cole watched his sister, Edith, pack her bags. She mentioned she would be away for a few days, and Cole observed the pile of clothes on the bed, realizing they were not meant for visiting nobility or attending dinners. Edith praised Cole for his observation with a smile. However, turning serious, she advised Cole to always maintain elegance when in the company of ladies, causing him to shiver. Edith then inquired about Cole's experience working at the city hall. Cole, who had not revealed his identity, said he diligently did his job, though he wondered why his sister hadn't arranged for him to work in her department. Edith smiled, explaining that the city hall wasn't as straightforward as it seemed, and with Minister Barav closely monitoring her, she couldn't afford to be seen as biased, especially since they represented their family. Cole bowed his head, thoughtful. After a moment, he nodded seriously, assuring her he would be mindful of this. Seeing her little brother had been more mature, she also remembered what their father once said. Cole's timid nature and lack of combat strength made him unsuitable to lead the family. However, in the city of Neverwinter, her little brother wouldn't need to act as a lord defending their territory with knights or fight in the front line when there's a battle. Cole would surely find his own significance in the city of Neverwinter. Casually picking up a long dress and holding it up to himself, Cole was especially eager to know where Edith was headed. Edith informed him that the mission was confidential and that knowing more would come at a cost. Cole thought this was a joke, and continued to wanting to know. With a smirk, Edith revealed they were heading to the Snowy Mountains in the western region to explore alongside the First Army and Witch Union. Cole, curious, asked why they needed to explore there. Edith calmly mentioned unknown hybrid monsters or a different civilization. Encountering anything would not be surprising, including the king's new alliance with tentacled creatures. Cole's jaw dropped in shock, unable to comprehend how his sister was not frightened by such terrifying prospects or how tentacled creatures could become allies of the king. For a moment, Cole thought his sister had lost her mind. Edith shifted the topic while asking if Cole remembered why they had pledged allegiance to the king. Cole responded it was for greater power. Edith noted his answer wasn't entirely accurate but wasn't wrong either. Power comes from vast lands and people. Once His Majesty defeated all of the civilizations, even the demons, then the power they could share would extend beyond human territories. Cole stood still, taking a while to digest this information. Nonetheless, Edith, pointing to the long dress, then tells him to wear it. She tells Cole it's time to pay the price. Meanwhile, in the Southern Territory, Lorca gazed across the vast desert. Unsure of her exact location, however, she could hear strange sounds beneath her feet. Suddenly, a massive sandworm emerged from beneath the ground, its appearance fierce and terrifying. Before the sandworm stood a young girl who seemed to appear out of nowhere. Facing the giant sandworm, she didn't seem afraid. Turned out, she jumped high and struck the sandworm's head with a punch before piercing its skull with a spear. Lorca watched in disbelief. The girl was no other than her younger self. She remembered clearly, at just 12 years old, she had completed her first hunt, discovering a love for the thrill of combat. Her second hunt was against a giant scorpion, which Lorca defeated with ease, severing its tail and then its head. The third time, this time, she was facing dozens of desert wolves. Nonetheless, she was still fearless, engaging them with dual blades. However, luck was not on her side this time, and she was eventually overwhelmed by the pack. Just as she thought she would meet her end there, she awakened her goddess power, transforming into a red wolf. The excruciating pain of the transformation awakened her powers. Standing amidst the blood-stained sands, she looked down upon the wolves, which all submitted before her gaze, bowing with their heads low. Soon, she faced her ultimate foe, an eagle-like demonic beast. Lorca charged at the beast in the sky, the two massive creatures clashing with blood and feathers scattering in the air. She wished for a second chance, but the opportunity would not come. The scene slowly shifts away from her. Fear gripped her heart, causing her to tremble. She refused to spend the rest of her life lying in bed and became useless. She wanted to stand up and continue fighting. Lorca abruptly opened her eyes, sitting up straight. Cold sweat soaked her back and the bedsheet. Hearing the scream, a maid rushed in and began to wipe the cold sweat from her body. Lorca looked around in disbelief. Her hands, eyes, and even her feet had no issues, and she felt no pain anywhere on her body. She rolled out of bed and stood firmly on the ground. Puzzled, she looked at the maid, who explained that people from the north had brought a new goddess who had healed her. The young goddess hadn't used any herbs, yet Lorca was miraculously healed. Remembering the words Ashes had said to her, it seemed that what she said wasn't merely words of comfort. She hurriedly dressed, ready to go out and express her gratitude, but the maid informed her that they had already left. The Asha clan had traveled to Grey Castle with the first group of sand people 2 days earlier, and Ashes and the others had left with them. Feeling a bit lost, Lorca then asked how long she had been unconscious. The maid showed 3 fingers and then added another 3. Lorca looked back at the bed she had just lain in, realizing she had had a very long dream over these 6 days. She then inquired about recent events and learned that the previous second clan had absorbed the severely weakened Blackwater clan before issuing a sacred duel to her own clan. However, her father, the chief, conceded defeat immediately, and as a result, their clan had fallen to 3rd place. This also meant they would have to leave the castle. Without saying much, Lorca stormed out to find her father. The maid hurriedly picked up her hood, but Lorca touched her ears and tail, smiling and saying she no longer needed a hood. As she walked out, she remembered her father's advice to hide her features as much as possible, but Lorca had finally found what she really wanted. On her way, she saw many clan members carrying their belongings back and forth, clearly reluctant and saddened by leaving the fortress. Soon, she arrived at her father's castle. The guards were delighted to see their princess. Lorca smiled and asked if her father was inside, and the guard nodded, hesitating, but then mentioned there were other people inside too. Standing outside, Lorca could clearly hear the arguments inside. It seemed like there was a dispute between her brother and another party, who not only failed to honor their agreement to give them enough time but also insulted their clan. Walking inside, she saw her brother had drawn his weapon against them, followed by the sounds of swords being unsheathed. Her father, in a low voice, ordered everyone to sheath their weapons. Looking towards the door, he was pleased to see his daughter. Her brother's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of his sister, his expression a mix of shock and surprise. The other party was also in disbelief. Many had witnessed Lorca had broken all of her bones on the stage. It seemed impossible for her to stand up, let alone be able to walk. They also noticed the ears on her head and the tail behind her. The man gulped hard, losing his earlier composure and stepping back a few steps, telling her that regardless, Lorca's clan had already admitted defeat, and if they wanted to challenge again, they would have to wait 6 months. Lorca calmly stated they would respect the outcome, then asked who Kabucha was. The person who had been speaking pointed to himself, admitting it was him, and then urged Lorca and her clan to hurry and leave. Without giving him another chance to speak, Lorca punched him in the jaw, sending him flying. As this was his punishment for disrespecting her father earlier. Everyone was stunned, but no one dared to approach. Lorca glared at them, declaring that even though their clan had fallen to third place, the dignity of their chief was not to be violated. She then ordered them all to GTFO. The few quickly carried the unconscious Kabucha and ran out, not daring to say another word. Seeing the enemy leave, Lorca's brother immediately turned to their father, suggesting that since Lorca was unharmed, they could return here in 6 months. He also proposed that their father negotiate with the other clan's chief, arguing that since they were going to lose anyway, it might be better to maintain the status quo. The other guards seemed excited, agreeing with the prince's suggestion. The chief, however, did not respond but looked at Lorca, wanting to hear her thoughts. Lorca glanced at the guards and then at her brother. Biting her lip, she finally let out a sigh, revealing that she had come to say goodbye. When everyone heard that Lorca intended to leave, they were stunned. Her brother was the first to speak, asking about their clan's future and how they would handle future sacred duels. Lorca did not answer but silently looked at her father. The chief paused for a moment and then gestured for everyone to leave, wanting to speak with Lorca alone. After the guards bowed and left, the prince, hesitating to say more, eventually turned and left. When only the two of them remained, the chief asked if Lorca intended to go up north. Lorca does not hide her intentions. She tells him that she wants to find Ashes first and then travel together to the city of Neverwinter. The chief did not respond to this but instead inquired about what would happen to their clan. Without hesitation, Lorca suggested that they should head up north too and settle there, avoiding further battles over resources and food. She looked at her father, knowing he must have considered this already, otherwise, he would not have refused the other clan's challenge. The chief remained silent, listening to Lorca speak. Lorca understood that her father was not one to admit defeat easily. Even against a formidable opponent, he would ensure they paid a price. Their position as the first clan for years was a testament to their spirit. Clearly, the chief was prepared to lead the clan away from their current home, rendering the sacred duels meaningless. He no longer wished to see his warriors sacrifice themselves for feudal conflicts. After a moment of silence, the chief smiled, wondering whether Lorca was naturally intelligent or just as sharp as a wolf. Turned out, Lorca was right. The chief had indeed been waiting for Lorca to wake up first and discuss relocation. Lorca shook her head, also her long pointy ears, while claiming she didn't understand those matters and was not naturally intelligent, as she only believed in the strength of her fists. The chief looked at her, puzzled. Lorca explained that fighting someone allowed her to understand what kind of person they were. Using the combat skills that her father had taught her from a young age through personal combat training. Hence, she could guess her father's thoughts as well. The chief laughed heartily and then asked Lorca how she viewed Ashes. Recalling how Ashes had protected her, Lorca described her as someone who didn't talk much but a perfect guardian. Smiling at the thought, Lorca mused that anyone protected by Ashes must feel warm and secure. Hearing this, the chief finally made up his mind and decided to lead the clan up north in a few days. Lorca, however, planned to set off alone ahead of them. She wanted to see for herself if what was promised was true and if they really could have their own oasis. While Lorca trusted Ashes, she remained skeptical of others, even stating that if the king of Grey Castle deceived her, she would teach him a lesson. "Oof, little girl, you sure about that?" The chief, intrigued, asked what if everything they were told was true. Would Lorca pledge loyalty or serve him? He even began to imagine his daughter married to the king of Grey Castle, causing Lorca to blush, her ears twitching and eyes involuntarily shifting away as she murmured that no one would fancy a half-human, half-beast creature. "Well, I'm sure that Roland would love to pat you on the head." The chief chuckled and didn't press further on the topic. Instead, he asked Lorca to come closer. He wanted to take a good look at his daughter. As usual, Lorca approached and bowed down before him, and the chief affectionately patted her hair and fluffy ears and thanked her for all these years of sacrifice. During the night, having packed her belongings, Lorca left Iron Sand City with a huge backpack on her back. Entering the quiet and desolate desert, she looked around to ensure no one was around. Then, she set down her backpack and took off her clothes, folding each piece neatly into her backpack. She then looked up at the moon, feeling the wind while transforming into a giant red wolf. She lifted her head and let out a satisfying howl. The heavy backpack, now held in her mouth, seemed very small. Moments later, she once again embarked on her journey up north. Back in the city of Neverwinter, Roland was working in his office. Normally, the person sitting by his side would be Nightingale, but today, it was Anna who was sitting there. Glancing at the slender long legs seated on the desk, he blushed slightly. Anna smiled gently and asked if he was feeling unaccustomed to the change. Roland, feeling a bit awkward, scratched the back of his head. As it turned out, during Nightingale's absence, the responsibility of guarding the king had been passed on to Anna. Before departure, Anna had also instructed Nightingale to take good care of everyone before watching the ship set sail. In the office, Anna took Roland's hand, noticing his concern for the upcoming Snowy Mountain expedition. She reassured him that with 50 God's Punishment Witches, 500 elite First Army soldiers, and the sisters from the Witch Union, no one could harm them. Not long after, Phyllis entered the office. This surprised Roland a bit since he had assumed she would be interested in the expedition. It turned out that Phyllis stayed behind because Pasha wanted her to. Being the most familiar with the castle among the Takira witches, she was the best candidate for the bodyguard. Leaving a God's Punishment Witch to guard the castle was actually a request from Pasha herself as well. Although Anna's abilities were strong, her ability would be ineffective against the Stone of God Punishment. Anna is super smart, however, his strength does not lie in her combat abilities. Considering these factors, Pasha insisted on having a God's Punishment Witch as a close bodyguard. Roland nodded, thanking Phyllis for her assistance. Phyllis bowed and then headed out, but before she left, she told Roland she would be waiting in the hall at all times. If he ever needed her, she would be here right away. She then turned to both of them with a slight smirk, suggesting they didn't need to mind her and could continue what they were doing, which made both of them blush. Late at night, after returning to the castle and after round 1, Roland asked Anna if she would find it boring to be in the office every day. Anna shook her head, saying she could still do her own daily work while accompanying Roland. She even thought Roland might grow tired of seeing her every day. Hearing this, Roland flipped over, pinning Anna beneath him, wanting to prove just how untired of her he was. Well, the details that follow are best left to the imagination. After a long while, we once again returned to the dream world, where Roland opened his eyes and stretched out his arms. Looking around, the familiar settings made him realize that he was once again in the dream world. As Roland was eating breakfast prepared by Zero, she wondered why he got up so late today. After a quick wash in the bathroom, Roland joked about being an adult who enjoys nightlife and sleeping in on his days off. Zero teased him, pointing out that Roland always comes home early and seems like the kind of uncle without a career or a girlfriend. Roland almost choked on his mouthwash at that comment. He wanted to argue but decided not to bother with a little brat and instead loudly declared he was going on a date soon. After getting dressed in a new suit, Roland headed to the neighboring apartment. This wasn't really a date, but a scheduled meeting. He didn't want to be looked down upon in front of little Zero. Just as he was about to knock, he heard a scream from his own suite. The person screaming was no other than Zero. Turning around, he saw her panic-stricken, running out of the apartment. Roland initially thought Zero might have seen a mouse, but she stammeringly pointed at the door, saying there was a strange person in the house. Rushing back, Roland discovered a strange woman in their room, wearing a long robe. However, she was very beautiful. Zero, hiding behind Roland, nervously mentioned she heard Roland leave and was checking if the door was properly locked when she turned around to find someone suddenly behind her. The woman turned around at the noise, and Roland instinctively clenched his fists. He was shocked when the woman happily yet uncertainly called him "Your Majesty Roland." Hearing this, both Zero and Roland were stunned. Roland cautiously asked who she was, and to his surprise, she said she was Phyllis, who seemed confused by the current situation just as he was. A series of questions flooded Roland's mind. especially how Phyllis could enter this dream world and why Anna couldn't. Zero, sensing something was off, quickly asked if they knew each other and why she called Roland Your Majesty, wondering if they were playing some role-playing game. Roland found himself having to concoct an excuse, telling Zero that the stranger was a relative of his and that the Your Majesty title was just a joke. Now somewhat calmer but still curious, Zero had more questions, especially since Roland had appeared just as scared as she was and had asked the stranger for her identity. Roland, keeping his composure, deflected by joking that he had seen a scaredy cat screaming her head off, nearly wetting her pants, which caused Zero's cheeks to flush with embarrassment. Before she could retort, Roland pulled her aside, whispering that Phyllis had been there all along and Zero simply hadn't noticed while busy with her homework, signaling Phyllis to leave quickly. However, Phyllis, being astute, hurried to explain she hadn't intended to scare her. She had wanted to greet Zero upon seeing Roland leave, but Zero had run out screaming. Roland quickly reassured Zero that it was all a misunderstanding, exacerbated by her initial scream. Zero, momentarily speechless and on the verge of tears, seemed to be deeply embarrassed. Feeling he might have been too harsh, Roland gently patted the little girl's head, assuring her it was all a misunderstanding, and suggested she return to her studies. Zero, holding back tears, angrily kicked Roland on the shin before storming off to her room, leaving Roland jumping from the pain. Phyllis couldn't help but laugh, remarking that in this place, Roland did not seem like the supreme mortal king back in Grey Castle. Roland, with a smile, said that might be true, however, he was also the master and only ruler of this world. He then invited Phyllis to his room as he had many questions for her. After some while, their conversation confirmed that the woman before him was indeed the real Phyllis, as she mentioned details about Takira, being number 76, and Grey Castle. However, Roland was puzzled about how Phyllis had entered this world, especially appearing as her true self rather than in her god's punishment body. Phyllis explained she was unclear herself. She had meant to enter a deep sleep to regenerate her stamina, and the next thing she saw was finding herself here upon waking. Roland then explained that this place was what he called the dream world, a world that he could only enter while sleeping. While Roland found it odd to have an outsider enter his dream world, he decided to conduct some tests. First, he brought out a ladder, explaining that falling from a height in this world typically sent him back to the real world. He then asked Phyllis to try it and mentioned they would meet again in the castle hall afterward. Unexpectedly, Phyllis suddenly grabbed his arm, a move that took him by surprise. The next moment, Phyllis asked if Roland could pinch her with all his strength. Confused, Roland watched as Phyllis rolled up her sleeve, exposing her arm and insisting on being pinched as hard as he could. Oof, I'm not sure where this is going. Roland initially thought she wanted to use pain to wake up, but suddenly, Roland remembered that once a witch becomes a god's punishment, witches they lose their sense of feeling pain. Realizing her intent, Roland hesitated for a moment before reaching out and twisting her arm with considerable force. Phyllis clenched her teeth, emitting a deeply satisfied moan from her throat as her body trembled. Oh, man, what's happening here? Meanwhile, Zero came out of her room to get some water. However, she saw that the two were no longer in the living room. Turning around, she saw Roland's door being locked. Curious, she leaned against the door and immediately heard a series of indescribable moans, which made her blush and feel embarrassed. Inside the room, Phyllis let out a sigh of relief. Clasping her hands together, she said she could finally feel pain again. Her cheeks were still very flushed, as if, well, you know what I mean. At this moment, Phyllis seemed like a different person, her eyes almost shining as she looked at Roland. Roland let out a shrug while saying Phyllis could do it herself. Hearing this, she shook her head, saying it wasn't the same, suddenly knelt down on one knee, and said earnestly that although this world might be just a dream to him, she was willing to give everything. She wasn't sure if she could return here in the future. All she wanted to ask Roland to let her stay here a little longer. Roland took a deep breath, thinking that the Takira witches like Phyllis hadn't felt her senses for over 400 years. To him, this world was just a bizarre fictional place, but for Phyllis, it must be a long-desired dream world. However, it was too cruel for Phyllis to come to a long-lost dream world only to experience pain again. Roland sighed softly, reached out to help her up, and decided to conduct a test later. After standing up, Phyllis once again bowed to him by lifting her hands to her chest, she finally understanding why the witches in the Witch Union loved Roland so much. Roland was about to say something when the bedroom door was suddenly knocked loudly, and Zero's voice came from outside, telling them that the tea was ready and asking if they wanted any. Roland opened the door, only to see a little Zero with empty hands. Her face was somewhat red but seemed a bit angry. She peeked in, scrutinizing Phyllis up and down with a wary eye. When asked where the tea was, Zero told him to fetch it himself, then pointed at the two of them, telling them not to make strange noises. After closing the door again, Phyllis, curious, asked about the relationship between the two. Roland did not explain much, and seeing that Roland did not want to elaborate, she did not ask further. Biting her lip with some anticipation, she looked at Roland, hoping he would try a few more times in other ways, doing her best to make no sound. Roland, feeling a bit overwhelmed, decided to take Phyllis out for a stroll, thinking it would be a good distraction. Phyllis was initially surprised, worrying it might inconvenience Roland. However, he assured her that in this world, she could be considered a celebrity, hinting at the differences between this dream world and their reality on how everyone sees witches and their power. Phyllis's excitement grew, especially at the prospect of exploring whether this world had taverns and hotels. Why does she want to visit a hotel? Anyway, suddenly, Roland remembered he had plans and made a phone call to cancel. No doubt, the loud complaints from Garcia on the other end of the line made Roland turn away, her anger palpable even through the speaker. Roland explained he had a guest over, leading to a brief silence followed by Garcia saying that she would come to him instead. When Roland said he wasn't at his apartment, Garcia raised her voice again, furious about him canceling a meeting she had arranged with a senior member of her association, accusing him of irresponsibility. The taxi driver caught the words about not taking responsibility and gave Roland a peculiar look, prompting Roland to pretend the signal was bad and hang up. Zero, sitting between them, scoffed at Roland's cliché excuse. Meanwhile, Phyllis was glued to the window, amazed by everything outside, earning envious glances from the taxi driver. Before leaving, Roland had picked out a new set of clothes for Phyllis, and they eventually stopped at a fast food restaurant. Phyllis, following Roland's advice, had kept her curiosity in check, mimicking the actions of others around her despite the novelty of it all. However, when she took a bite of the hamburger Roland handed to her, tears uncontrollably streamed down her face, overwhelming her with emotion. Zero was confused by Phyllis's reaction. Roland, taking a deep breath, explained that Phyllis's family treated her poorly and she hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. This explanation softened Zero's expression, likely evoking a sense of empathy and making the little girl think about herself. As Zero now affectionately called Phyllis Big Sister, Roland watched the ancient Takira which tearfully devouring the fast food, a mix of emotions stirred within him. What was a simple pleasure for him represented a dream worth sacrificing everything for in their eyes. Uncertain if there would be another opportunity like this, he resolved to make the most of their time together, fulfilling her desires as much as possible in this dream world. Every bite filled Phyllis with happiness, drawing astonished looks from other fast food restaurant patrons due to the array of meal boxes spread across their table, which would be enough for more than a dozen people. Zero wiped Phyllis's mouth while watching her eat. Once Phyllis had nearly finished, Roland inquired if she had noticed anything strange before coming here. Glancing at Zero beside her, Phyllis quickly grasped his meaning and explained that the dreams of her past were long gone, nothing special, just leaning against the wall and cutting off consciousness as before to aid her recovery while maintaining vigilance. Roland asked if she could still sense changes in her surroundings after disconnecting her consciousness. Phyllis nodded, saying that even as her consciousness sank into darkness, she could still feel danger around her. It was not through sight or sound, and she couldn't explain it very well. Zero, eating ice cream while pouting, didn't understand a word they were saying. Roland suggested that if Zero was bored, she could walk around the nearby park. The little Zero huffed discontentedly and left the restaurant with her ice cream. Phyllis, looking through the window at the girl who just walked out of the restaurant, asked Roland if she was going to be okay. Roland smiled, assuring that this place was very safe and Zero was a very smart girl too. Phyllis then began to explain that once she entered deep sleep, everything would be pitch black, and there would be no light or sound. However, this time, she arrived in this world instead. Roland thought it over since Phyllis had done this many times, and nothing strange had happened. He then realized the only difference was this time, she was within the castle, sleeping just a wall apart from him, but that couldn't be all, there must be something special. All of a sudden, both of them thought of the light pillars. That's right, since Phyllis was sleeping a wall apart from him, their light pillars must have overlapped. Roland shook his head and thought further, that's not it, the light pillar didn't fully explain everything, considering Nightingale and Anna should also have entered this world if that was the case. Engaged in a mental brainstorm, Roland suddenly had an idea. Suddenly, a loud crash was heard, interrupting what he was about to say, and what followed was shards of glass from the windows scattered across the floor. People in the restaurant and on the street panicked and fled from all directions, many being pushed and shoved around in the commotion. It turned out someone had spotted a fallen. Phyllis was confused, as Roland had just mentioned that the area was safe a minute ago. This left Roland speechless. However, he had acknowledged that he had seen increasing reports in newspapers and news about people in the dream world awakening natural forces, but most turned into uncontrollable monsters. After finishing the last bite of her burger, Phyllis asked Roland whether they should deal with the enemy first or go to the park to find Zero. Roland headed towards the back door, knowing that the park was safe for now, and they needed to confront this threat first. He explained that Phyllis should consider the enemy a kind of hybrid demon beast, which had to be defeated with the natural forces, known as magic, of this world. He later explained that in this world, both men and women could possess this power, and Roland demonstrated it. Phyllis looked at Roland in surprise. He then asked if Phyllis could use her magic. She then tried to utilize her magical energy within her. Phyllis found it difficult at first due to her prolonged disuse of this body. Soon, a powerful magical energy emanated from Phyllis, and claw-like wings appeared behind her. This was Phyllis's ability, capable of extending and retracting within her power range, sharper than any blade. It turned out that Phyllis was once a powerful combat witch who had once served as a close guard in the top 3 seats during the Takara era. As Phyllis's magic dispersed, the Fallen was expected to arrive soon. The two then headed towards the back door when suddenly their surroundings exploded with a loud bang, and walls shattered as a figure appeared. Roland frowned as he saw a man charging towards Phyllis. One of his hands started to gather energy. Phyllis didn't even bother dodging, instead, she charged at the attacker. Roland wanted to stop her, trying to remind her that she was no longer in the body of a god punishment witch. Phyllis clearly forgot all about this. When their energies collided, Phyllis was sent flying several meters back. Roland quickly caught her, absorbing the impact together. The blast sent them through several walls, finally crashing into a room. Roland, covered in dust, coughed a few times. He checked for any injuries. Aside from a numb back, he was unharmed. He then looked at Phyllis in his arms and asked how she was. Phyllis, with her head down, slowly stood up. Her clothes were torn in several places, one of her claw-like wings was ripped off, and her face was scraped. However, she didn't seem bothered, rather assured Roland that the fight would soon be over. The Fallen slowly approached them, kicking aside a broken wing lying at his feet, and then with a hideous smile, he once again gathered energy in his hands while trying to attack Phyllis again. However, he failed to notice the wing he had kicked onto the side was not flying back towards him, and in the next second, before he knew it, his head had fallen to the ground. Phyllis then recalled her wing, reattaching it to her back. It turned out that as long as it was within a 5-meter range, the detached wing was even more threatening. Observing the energy in the Fallen's hand, it didn't dissipate, rather just stopped spinning. She wondered if this was the natural force Roland spoke of, the magical energy of this world. Curious, she started poking at the energy and found she could pick it up. She then handed it to Roland. In Roland's hands, the energy spun rapidly before transforming into a dazzling beam of light that shot up to the ceiling, with light sparks gradually dissipating into the air. Roland was at a loss for words to explain what had just happened, perhaps suggesting it was a way of returning the magic back to the world. They quickly left the scene, as Roland did not want anyone to see what happened. Phyllis found it odd, considering they had defeated an enemy. However, Roland explained that in this era, even the most vicious of individuals could only be apprehended, locked up, and judged by designated authorities and personnel. Roland took off his jacket and draped it over Phyllis, and then they hurried away from the location. Phyllis glanced back at the ruins, only to remark on the strangeness of this era. They hadn't gone far when Roland saw Zero running against the crowd towards them, looking very worried. She tried to push through the people until she saw Roland, her expression shifting from anxiety to relief, and then immediately to anger. Roland bent down while ruffling her hair and apologizing for making her worry. Zero's cheeks flushed, she pouted, and then she grabbed onto Phyllis's hand, leading them away from the area together. Before heading home, the three of them decided to stop by a hot pot restaurant. Little Zero was eating so heartily that her face was covered in oil, all the while complaining about Roland being cheap and only ordering the cheap stuff. Phyllis, on the other hand, was enjoying everything on the table, even daring to drink the spicy oil broth, which startled the waiter. Later in the night, they finally made their way home. Phyllis suddenly noticed a figure standing in the shadows. Upon closer look, it was Garcia. Roland immediately knew he messed up. Garcia must have been waiting for him ever since he had hung up the phone on her. Standing in the corridor with an icy expression on her face, however, she didn't speak, as if waiting for Roland to explain. It was Roland who awkwardly pointed at Phyllis, saying he was just taking care of a relative, just like what he said on the phone. Garcia, on the other hand, seemingly unbothered, simply told Roland it was time to talk, and she then forcefully grabbed Roland's hand, dragging him away. Seeing this, Phyllis intervened, clearly not happy with Garcia's brusque demeanor, and even began telling her that Roland was the master of this world. However, Roland quickly covered her mouth before she could finish her sentence, leaving Garcia looking puzzled. Roland then urged Phyllis and Zero to go back inside first and promised he would return soon. Reflecting on what he did, Roland felt a bit guilty for ghosting Garcia and for making a poor excuse over the phone. Anyone would have been upset by this. Soon, he arrived at Garcia's door. Seeing it was Roland, she closed the door and pinned him against it. With a smirk, she asked if Roland had made up his mind, or if everything was just an excuse. Roland, nonchalantly breaking free from her grasp, walked towards the couch. Garcia, still looking quite upset, questioned whether Roland no longer wished to join their association. Sitting down, Roland asked for water, preferably with ice. Garcia's eyes flashed with anger as she went to pour him a glass of iced water. While drinking the water, Roland then calmly mentioned the increasing reports of the fallen, noting he had encountered one during his lunch earlier today. He asked if the association was facing any trouble. Garcia, realizing Roland had been near the park, knew exactly what he was talking about. Turned out, earlier today, the incident prompted her and several martial fighters to rush to the scene. However, by the time they arrived, the fallen were already dead, and their magical core was missing. Hearing this, while pretending ignorance, Roland asked who it was and who killed it. Garcia shook her head, indicating the question was off limits as it involved the association's secrets. Nonetheless, Roland was on point, as the association was indeed experiencing difficulties as external corruption was accelerating, leading them towards an impending crisis. Hearing the word external corruption made Roland furrow his brows, and he pressed on to ask her to elaborate. However, Garcia let out a sigh, admitting that she didn't know either, or perhaps that no one did. It could be the end of the world, or it might result in everyone turning into monsters. However, she earnestly explained that it was precisely because of this uncertainty that the association needed more people to stand up against external corruption. She argued that it was the responsibility of everyone who had awakened power. Garcia's tone rose slightly as she became more impassioned, saying even if there might be sacrifices in battle, that it was a martial fighter's sacred duty. She understood why Roland might be concerned, but stressed that if every martial fighter hesitated or feared, then no one would be left to protect the people. Garcia's candidness took Roland by surprise, yet it was also apparent why she struggled to recruit more members. Roland didn't immediately respond. Instead, his thoughts drifted to the Red Moon. Initially, he had wanted to join the association for the fat paycheck, but it now seemed the situation was far more complex than that. He felt it might be necessary to leverage the strength of the Martial Fighter Association to uncover the truths of this world. After a prolonged silence, Garcia couldn't help but press Roland for an answer. Snapped out of his reverie, Roland casually mentioned that he would join. Hearing this, caught Garcia off guard. She was both happy and surprised. Nonetheless, from that moment on, Roland was officially a member of their association. Returning home, Roland explained to Phyllis about Garcia's identity and why she was important. He advised Phyllis not to take others' attitudes to heart, as in this world no one knew his true identity. Phyllis still seemed a bit troubled, but Roland had fulfilled her request, allowing her to experience being a human again, earning her genuine respect. This was the reason why she was displeased with others' lack of respect towards Roland, especially since this was the world he had created. Roland, with a smile, clarified that the inhabitants of this world had their own complete memories and thoughts, independent of Roland, and the world itself operated on its own rules. Hearing this, Phyllis's eyes sparkled up. She leaned in and whispered, asking if this was the world where Roland had previously lived, perhaps already suspecting the Prince of Grey Castle was just a facade. Roland was taken aback by how she figured out, momentarily at a loss for words. He tried to remain composed and asked why she would think that, though internally, he was becoming gradually more anxious. Phyllis blinked and explained that it was because of the city of Neverwinter, the very city that Roland created, which was designed in a similar manner to this world. She had been confused as to why Roland planning to build a city like that, until she saw cars on the road earlier today, realizing the roads weren't meant for carriages, rather it was for cars. The tall buildings, machines, and powerful weapons all seemed to tie back to this world. Roland pondered for a moment before deciding to keep the secret about him getting isekai'd into this world. He explained that he was the real fourth prince, but that he had suddenly acquired additional memories. However, he only managed to possess a small portion of this profound knowledge. He hoped this could convince Phyllis. As for his deepest secrets, he wished to share them only with those closest to him. Phyllis seemed not to doubt his words in the slightest, even considering the memories a divine gift to Roland by the gods. Perhaps Roland was truly the chosen one. She firmly believed that with Roland by their side, they could surely defeat the demons. Roland was surprised that she suddenly became so confident, given that all they had done was go out for the day. Phyllis tells him that it is all because of the cars. In the Takira days, they needed a plethora of horses and carriages to transport military supplies to the front lines, which limited their reach. However, their enemies had a better logistical capability. Phyllis's assessment of strength based on transportation capabilities intrigued Roland. She elaborated that the cars and trucks they saw today could achieve what Takira could only dream of, and coupled with powerful weapons, they were sure to defeat the demons. Roland was impressed by the Takira witch's keen insight. The fact that she could deduce so much from just observing crowded buses and trucks proved just how smart they were. In the end, Phyllis stood up, she bowed deeply, and despite Roland not being a witch or capable of wielding the instrument, she believed he was the chosen one bestowed by the gods. Roland was happy to see that he could finally fully integrate the Takira witch into Neverwinter, and this would be very beneficial for future developments. As the day came to an end, it was time to return to the real world. Roland placed a ladder in front of the bed, and Phyllis climbed up step by step. Looking out at the world outside the window, she lingered for a moment but quickly recognized that it wasn't her world. She closed her eyes and let herself fall from the ladder back onto the bed, however nothing happened. It seemed that only when Roland left this world could Phyllis possibly leave as well. As Roland climbed the ladder, Phyllis approached him, having already guessed that there were two possibilities: either she would return to the original world with Roland, or she would be trapped here forever. Regardless, she expressed her hope that Roland to not worry about her. She would always cherish the memories of everything that happened that day. Roland nodded, then let himself fall backward. The next moment, he felt the weight of Anna's head resting peacefully on his arm, her lips curled into a slight smile as if she were dreaming something pleasant. Carefully, Roland extracted his arm without waking her, covered her with the blanket, and quietly left the room. Walking down the stairs, the soldiers who saw him all stood at attention, but Roland gestured for them to relax and proceeded to the main hall alone. There, he found Phyllis, who seemed a bit dejected but managed to muster a slight smile. Looking at Roland, she quietly said her dream had ended. Perhaps the transition from a god punishment which dedicated to fighting demons to experiencing a vibrant world capable of being a human again had understandably left Phyllis feeling ambivalent. Yet, she suppressed these emotions for the sake of her comrades in Takira and her obsession with battling demons. Roland admired her dedication and, with a smile, suggested that there might be a chance to return there in the future. He decided to continue experimenting and prepared a makeshift bed in the main hall with the soldiers standing guard by the door. Phyllis, sitting next to him, blushed slightly as she looked at Roland, who also felt a bit embarrassed as he closed his eyes. After a while, Roland fell asleep, and their light pillars merged once again. Back in the dream world, it was still nighttime, and Roland found someone lying beside him. Phyllis suddenly opened her eyes, incredulous at the sight before her. Seeing Roland smiling at her, she couldn't help but throw herself into his arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. At this moment, the distinction between dreams and reality seemed irrelevant to her. What mattered was that after centuries of suffering and duty, she was finally able to enjoy life. Once Phyllis calmed down, she stepped back, knelt on one knee, and pleaded with Roland to allow her to share this news with the rest of the Takira witches, promising that they would forever remember Roland's kindness and serve him with utmost loyalty. Faced with this earnest request, Roland didn't respond immediately. He was a bit worried about how little Zero might react if she grew suspicious. It would be pretty hard to explain why over 100 witches came over to their home. Could he really pass them all off as relatives? Given that little Zero was the second creator of the dream world, there was no telling how she might react. If Roland truly intended to bring the Takira witches into this world, he realized he'd need to find a place for them to live. However, this wasn't Neverwinter, and he didn't have that much money. A moment of silence led Phyllis to think that Roland was rejecting her request. She then knelt on both knees, her forehead touching the ground as she tearfully pleaded with Roland. Noticing her misunderstanding, Roland quickly clarified he was actually pondering over where to settle the Takira witches. Upon hearing this, Phyllis's eye sparked, and smiled again. Not long after, they found themselves back in Neverwinter with the sunrise just breaking. Eager to share the good news, Phyllis rushed out of the main hall to tell the other Takira witches. Roland had already considered that the witches entering the dream world wouldn't be god punishment witches but actual witches who could truly use their abilities. With their help, exploring the dream world might become more efficient. Still quite tired, Roland yawned and slowly returned to the bedroom and took Anna back into his arms. Anna mumbled, questioning why Roland woke up so early. Roland mentioned he had encountered some issues in the dream world. Curled up against Roland's chest, Anna asked if he had a good dream, to which Roland smiled and said it was a good dream for everyone. He then explained what happened to Anna, who was genuinely happy to hear that the Takira witches could finally return to their real bodies in the dream realm. She then looked at Roland with a playful smile, teasingly asking if he felt guilty, given how beautiful those witches must be. Roland began to deny it, but Anna playfully covered his mouth, laying on his chest. She sensed a bit of guilt and concern, probably because Phyllis must be a very beautiful witch. Hearing this, Roland didn't want Anna to overthink it. Caught in an awkward moment, Anna chuckled while telling him she was joking, insisting that there was no need to have any concerns. Anna said Roland was the king, knowing that he was committed to helping everyone, just as he had helped Anna and the Witch Association before. Anna did not want to restrict Roland from doing anything but also expressed her wish for him to continue sharing his experiences of the dream world with her. Roland nodded in agreement, and Anna showed a content smile, slowly climbing onto him, while gently biting his collar. Cough cough, alright folks, I know none of you want to see what happens next, so I'll just leave it off here. Moving on the other side, when Phyllis brought back the astonishing news, the Takira witches were abuzz with excitement. Some were thrilled at the prospect of regaining their sense of touch and smell, while others were eager to taste foods like hamburgers and pizza. The witches gathered around Phyllis, all talking at once, until Pasha calmed everyone down, joking that with so many of them heading towards the castle together, it might look as if they were planning to attack Neverwinter. Alethea, leaning on Pasha, questioned whether this could be a trap set by the mortal king. Pasha let out a sigh followed by a wry smile, suggesting that even if it were a trap, most of them would still be willing to take the chance. Alethea, slightly irritated, insisted that Phyllis would never deceive them, though whether Phyllis herself had been deceived by Roland was another matter. Pasha decided to send a few to verify the truth, as the offer seemed too good to be true. She looked at Phyllis, asking if the king truly intended to allow them all into that world. Phyllis nodded but clarified not immediately, explaining that the other world had its own rules and to avoid unnecessary disruptions, Roland wished to initially allow only the selective few to join him. The plan would gradually expand to include more of them. Hearing this, Pasha felt more reassured. If Roland was really setting up a trap, then he would likely aim to lure as many as possible. However, this clearly wasn't the case. They then learned that Roland was in need of witches with agility, infiltration, control, and offensive capabilities. Alethea frowned while wondering why Roland needed these types of witches. Is he trying to take over the world? Phyllis, somewhat sheepishly, explained that Roland did not need them to take over the world but rather to undertake some clandestine looting operations targeting criminals. The room fell into a brief silence. Alethea grew angrier, couldn't believe Roland intended to use them as muscle. But her complaint was drowned out by the uproar of excitement from the others. None of them seemed concerned and even found the idea intriguing. They all began to tell Phyllis about their various abilities. Pasha, trying to soothe the visibly upset Alethea, reassured her that it's been way too long and everyone was just excited to finally experience a normal life. Once again, Roland returned to the dream world. Little Zero was dressed and ready for school, backpack slung over her shoulder, while Roland had just gotten up from the couch and started stretching. Little Zero, somewhat discontent, pointed out that despite Roland claiming he was going to look for a job, he seemed to spend all his days at home. Roland scratched his head and dismissed her concerns with a comment about her being too young to understand. Little Zero gave him a disdainful look, and then Roland stood up, excitedly declaring his job involved leading a team in technological breakthroughs and exploring territories unknown to mankind. Little Zero, even more skeptical, pouted and turned to leave, all the while sarcastically suggesting he go back to sleep since dreams have everything he could wish for. Roland, with a chuckle, mentioned he'd be working late tonight and tasked Little Zero with preparing her own dinner. She snorted in response and headed out. So what happened recently? Well, we got to go back in time. Exactly 3 days prior, the Takira witches had already sent volunteers into this world. Their worries and doubts lasted only about a day before being completely dispelled by the news that followed. Everything Phyllis had told them was true. The God Punishment witches were so overwhelmed with joy around Roland, some kneeling, others hugging him tightly, and a few even kissing him, unable to contain their happiness. Subsequently, all the Takira witches swore loyalty to him, acknowledging him as their sole leader. And, today marked the first day of action for their dream exploration team. Roland got dressed and left the apartment, then walked for a while before arriving at an abandoned warehouse that served as their base of operations, which had nearly drained all of Roland's money. Upon sliding the curtain door open, he was greeted by the aroma of food. Inside, he found several witches gathered around a table, savoring instant noodles as if they were eating the best food in the world, some even licking the seasoning packets clean. Watching this scene, Roland felt embarrassed for them. Followed by tapping everyone on the head, he then inquired about the surveillance on their target from a witch named Faldy. One of the witches stood up and reported that everything was proceeding normally. Faldy possessed exceptional reconnaissance abilities, utilizing small insects to scout areas. Although they couldn't provide visual feedback, they were capable of detecting magical energies or the natural forces of this world. Roland was quickly able to distinguish between martial fighters and those fallen to corruption. They had identified 6 targets, one of which resided in the luxury villa, making it their primary focus. Since it's a robbery, Roland naturally chose the more rich area, ensuring no one would trace them down. The 5 of them let out a deceptive smile before heading out. Glancing at his watch, Roland decided to take a taxi to their destination, causing some confusion among the witches, one of whom initially thought he meant a carriage. Phyllis patiently explained to them what a taxi was. Observing the group, Roland couldn't help feeling like he was taking kids on a spring trip. After getting off the taxi, the group ventured into the nearby woods and quickly located the villa. Another witch then employed her ability to summon a lightless veil, enveloping the group and rendering them invisible to the naked eye. This remarkable ability made everyone within the veil's coverage disappear from sight, pretty much invisible. But its utility extended far beyond mere invisibility, also masking sense and magical energy. They easily bypassed the guards and soon arrived at the largest villa, leaving Roland somewhat envious, given his recent budget only able to afford instant noodles for the witches. Approaching the surveillance system, the third witch took action. Her body seemingly sank into the ground, revealing her ability to merge into any shadow, especially under the cover of night, allowing her to infiltrate the villa with ease and unlock the main entrance for the rest. Once inside, Faldy detected someone in the living room with a strong magical energy. Roland turned to Phyllis, questioning her ability to handle the situation. Phyllis confidently asserted that as long as they weren't dealing with a high-ranked demon, she and Ling could easily manage. The group then proceeded into the villa. The room was cold, and seemed to be air-conditioned, but it had an awful smell. They noticed a man in a suit standing motionless in the center of the hall. As they cautiously approached him from behind, Roland's eyes caught sight of a huge monster statue hanging in front of the man. The eccentric tastes of the wealthy, Roland mused before they swiftly moved to action. As Phyllis and Ling launched their attack, the enemy turned around but was swiftly bisected by Phyllis before he could react. Ling, hiding in the shadows, questioned if that was all. Roland, covering his nose, noticed the air seemed to grow more putrid, questioning the witches if they remembered what he had taught them about what items to take and what to leave behind. Ling emerged, recalling Roland's instructions to only take gold jewelry, cash, and safe contents while leaving behind other gems that would be difficult to sell. As Roland bent down to extract the natural force from the suit-clad man, Faldy suddenly frowned. She could still sense the magical reaction lingering. Her gaze then fell upon the statue. Suddenly her pupils contracted, and she yelled out that the statue was alive. As she finished speaking, the statue abruptly opened its mouth wide and lunged at Roland. Without hesitation, Phyllis stepped in front of him while Roland grabbed her waist and rolled aside to dodge the attack. The monster then flew towards the corpse, consumed the natural core, and began to speak, saying how happy he was to see the feast delivered to its doorstep. It then spat out a beam, the force of which wrecked the hall and sent the witches crashing to the ground. Roland, using his natural force, shielded them, realizing the creature's magical power was near that of a high-ranking demon. The monster sneered, after hearing being called a demon. It coldly stated that they had stolen power from the divine realm without permission and now dared to label their pursuer as a demon, calling them foolish. Roland didn't understand what the creature meant and had no time to ponder as the massive beast approached him. Suddenly, a streak of black light leaped from the shadow behind the monster, stabbing its eye with a dagger. The figure disappeared back into the shadows upon landing. The dagger remained in the monster's eye. However, the monster appeared unharmed, even mocking them, having no idea how important the divine realm really is. As the creature began to glow, its body started to crack and disintegrate. When it finally revealed its true form, Roland was left in shock. He loudly demanded to know who the monster's master was. The creature responded, saying his master was beyond Roland's comprehension. Suddenly, it flew up into the air, radiating a red light, clearly intent on preventing anyone from escaping. In an instant, the floors, walls, and ceiling of the hall turned blood red, and Ling was forcibly ejected from the shadows, landing on Phyllis. Faldy stared in disbelief as tentacles emerged from the ground, immobilizing the witches. Gathering his strength, Roland charged at the monster. The monster was surprised to see Roland unaffected. It launched another beam at him, sending Roland crashing into a wall with a forceful blow. Phyllis looked on in concern as Roland coughed up blood but reassured her that he was okay. As Roland slowly stood up, something seemed to gather at his feet, drawing nearby magical energies towards him, which made the creature stunned. Then, with a powerful leap, Roland shot toward the enemy like a cannonball, unscathed by another beam the monster fired, thanks to the protective energy surrounding him. The next moment, Roland appeared right in front of the creature and punched, his arm penetrating the monster and grabbing a spherical object inside. The creature let out a deafening roar, screaming and yelling out why Roland possessed the power of its master. Then, a dazzling blue light enveloped Roland, turning the red sphere inside the monster blue. Suddenly, an eye appeared on the monster's head, and at this very moment, the monster realized that Roland was the person who created this world and affected its master. Looking at the monster disdainfully, Roland listened as the creature continued, saying Roland knew nothing. Despite its master being invincible, he cannot stop all of this. The monster's voice weakened, pleading with Roland not to return, as Roland's presence was destroying everything. All beings would perish. Roland wasn't bothered by the monster's words, rather he believed that the world would be better off without these demonic creatures. The creature's voice began to fade, its words becoming incomprehensible, but Roland thought he heard something about an abyssal realm and rules before it completely disintegrated. As the creature uttered its final words, it transformed into a beam of energy that shot up into the sky. He then checked on the witch's injuries. Although he was unsure of what just happened, he took the opportunity to retrieve the key from the corpse and secure a safe. Together with the witches, they quietly left the villa. The five of them took the keys, got into the garage, and drove away with a luxury car. Roland, who hadn't driven since his driving test during his college days, now found himself at the helm. In the car, the witches who had just survived a fierce battle seemed utterly exhausted. In the back seat, Faldy asked Roland what was the thing they just fought against, and how it managed to suddenly gain so much magical power. Roland, unsure himself, speculated that the creature was maybe made purely of magical energy, yet he was certain that it was not a demon. Ling, still visibly shaken, recounted how the room had been engulfed in red light, freezing her in place as if some terrifying force had its gaze fixed upon her, a feeling far more intense than any high-ranked demon she had encountered. Roland sought to comfort the witches, telling them that such monsters were exceedingly rare, otherwise, the world would have long been overrun. Phyllis didn't join the conversation, simply stared quietly at Roland and the steering wheel. Catching her gaze, Roland smiled and asked if she wanted to learn to drive, which she nodded eagerly. Winking at her, Roland quipped that they'd need to pull off a few more heists to enjoy daily luxuries like tasty foods, bigger mansions, and luxury cars for everyone. This perked up Faldy, especially at the mention of food. Although she had only heard of hamburgers and hot pot from Phyllis, all she had so far was instant noodles. However, she didn't mind it since it was equally delicious. Looking at the tired witches through the rearview mirror, Roland promised them that those were just the basics. Once they had enough money, they would taste the finest cuisines all around the world. The witches, energized by his words, sat up straight, mouth-watering and excited. Faldy said that once everyone was fully healed, they should quickly move on to their next target, which she had already scoped out. Dawn, one of the injured witches, chimed in with enthusiasm, insisting that she was fine and she was ready any time. The atmosphere in the car shifted from fatigue to a burgeoning excitement about their next grand adventure, or rather robbery. Roland never expected it was this simple to boost morale. As the witches continued their discussion about food, he slowly drove into the city. Carefully hiding the car, they then returned to the warehouse. Opening the safe, they found several bundles of cash and some jewelry. Unexpectedly, there were also a few spinning natural forces. Roland pondered whether the Fallen were now using these as a form of currency. Shortly after, Roland returned to his apartment. He tiptoed in only to find the lights still on in the living room. Zero was asleep in the living room, with her books spread out before her. It was obvious that she'd been studying and waiting for him. Seeing Zero drooling in her sleep, something seemed to touch Roland's heart. Though they were just tenant and landlords, he could feel a faint sense of family bonds forming between them. Gently, he picked her up and carried her back to her bed, tucking her in before returning to tidy up her books in the living room. One of the textbooks caught his attention. It was on Olympiad mathematics. It reminded him of his own middle school days when he had taken Olympiad classes. However, he thought the course was impractical. Roland had never been particularly interested in Olympiad mathematics, and had dropped it early on, so naturally, he wouldn't know much about its content. However, when he flipped open the textbook, to his astonishment, it wasn't blank. His breathing quickened with excitement. If you are wondering why Roland was so thrilled, this quick reminder that the dream world is very closely resembling the back on Earth, so the books, materials, and records existed just as they do here, but only containing knowledge that Roland himself knew or previously read. If he was unfamiliar with a topic or had never seen it, the pages would appear blank. In the next scene, we transition to a snowy, icy landscape. None other than the snowy mountains. Inside one of the tents, Lightning sat by a stove, holding a journal. She wrote that this was the 13th day of the expedition. Although it's been 15 days since winter has passed, the snow was still heavy around here. Fortunately, the ship's boiler continued to supply hot water and food. According to their original plan, they used Margie's magical arc ability to locate the ancient ruins, and with the help of the Takira witch who transferred onto a drilling worm to tunnel through the mountains. However, the mission was far more challenging than they expected. The mountain was riddled with caverns, making it difficult to find the actual passage leading to the ruins. Lightning and Maisie contributed to the search, but progress was slow. Nonetheless, Lightning remained undeterred. Much like her father always said, explorers are forever on the journey. Just as Lightning was about to rest after finishing recording her day, Wendy rushed into the tent. She was in a hurry. She tells Lightning that there had been an incident in the cave, and Fran was missing. Startled, Lightning stood up and quickly followed after Wendy. They arrived at the place of the incident. Lightning peered down where Fran allegedly fell into. Nightingale and Edith stood beside her, with Edith explaining that Sylvie had found the right passage, and Fran was working to clear the path, and maybe fall into the pit due to an unexpected cliff. Lightning noted Edith's use of words. She then asked what she meant by maybe. Edith elaborated that Sylvie saw Fran's magical energy suddenly vanish, but when she arrived, she couldn't see anything at the bottom of the pit. This was quite shocking. If Sylvie's abilities couldn't see what's underneath, then this cliff must have been super deep? There are only two explanations, either that the depth exceeded Sylvie's range of observation or that something was interfering with her abilities. Things seemed to get more complicated. At the same time, not far from them, an argument erupted between Agatha and the Takira witches, clearly about whether to go down immediately to rescue Fran. Taking a deep breath, Lightning knew the rescue mission would be very dangerous. The very bottom could be a trap set by enemies or inhabited by some unknown creature like the invisible mantis they saw months ago. She took a deep breath and then made up her mind. As a qualified explorer, she couldn't abandon any comrade. Approaching the arguing group, she tells them that she will be the first to go down and see what's underneath. One of the god punishment witches argued with Agatha, whom Lightning recalled was named Elena. As they chatted, they were worried that there could be something that interrupts a witch's ability. After all, Roland had decreed that no one should act alone and that the search should proceed with the support of the First Army. Lightning then shared her plan, suggesting that they tie a rope around her waist. If her abilities failed, they could pull her back up. As a distinguished explorer, she wouldn't abandon a comrade nor act recklessly. Nightingale, standing beside her, decided to accompany Lightning into the pit. Her ability allowed her to navigate effortlessly through the mist, and cliffs are nothing special to her. This also allows them to quickly retreat if they encounter enemies. Wendy, however, shook her head, as opposed to putting them in danger. She argued that if there were powerful enemies below, it was too dangerous for the two to venture down. Elena, perhaps sensing the witch union's concern, tells everyone that she won't abandon Fran and will go down by herself. Agatha's voice then grew stern as she asked whether 4 centuries had made them forget the importance of obeying orders. Her tone was serious, once again becoming the high-ranking witch from the Takira era. Hearing this, all of the god punishment witches fell silent, and Elena ultimately bowed to Agatha, obeying her orders. After a moment of silence, Edith tells everyone to stop arguing. She reminded them that Roland had instructed that exploration efforts must be coordinated among all parties. All they have to do is to find a way to let the First Army into the pit. Turned out, Edith had found a cliff next to a waterfall. In the next scene, we see Lightning strapped to a rope with a lift platform above her. On the platform were witches, god punishment witches, and 2 heavy machine gun teams. Agatha used her powers to freeze the water, filling in the cracks on the cliff to ensure a smooth descent of the lift basket. Turned out that Edith had come up with the idea to dismantle the ship's steam engine and have the god punishment witches transport it to the snowy mountains. They then boiled snow water to operate the engine, which in turn powered the lift basket, allowing the rescue team to safely into the pit. Elena couldn't help but marvel at the wisdom of mortals. Agatha nodded, telling her that perhaps within everyone here, Edith had the deepest understanding of the king's thoughts. Lightning did some quick math, and found out that this would make them lose 600 gold, but she smiled, knowing that if Roland were here, he would have chosen to rescue a comrade without hesitation. After all, that was just the kind of person Roland was. As they descended further, they all had a sinking feeling. At such a height, an ordinary person would have certainly died. However, Fran uses the drilling worm's body. They didn't know if she would be all right. Suddenly, Lightning halted, shouting that there was something ahead, then sped up her descent and finally reached the bottom. She checked the surroundings but didn't see Fran. Instead, she spotted several black stone towers within what appeared to be a demon's camp. Nightingale also jumped down, saying this might be the tower that the giant worm swallowed months ago. As the lift fully landed, Agatha surveyed the surroundings but still no sign of Fran. The First Army was on alert, lighting up the entire area. They noticed that beside the towers there were gaps on either side. They speculated whether Fran might have rolled down one of these gaps. Agatha knew that these black stone towers were rumored to be made of god punishment stones. However, these towers didn't broadly disrupt magic but could isolate it. Agatha channeled her ability and struck the tower, however, she couldn't even land a scratch. Lightning flew a bit lower, she heard the sound of running water. She speculated that Fran might have fallen down one of the sides due to an underground river, which could also explain why Sylvie hadn't detected Fran. Agatha nodded, agreeing that the stone towers had likely interfered with Sylvie's abilities, obscuring the view of the underground river. She instructed Lightning to fly up and relay the situation to Wendy, to bring more people down and establish a defensive line here. Lightning nodded and swiftly ascended. Soon, the team followed the riverbanks to an underground river. They were instantly captivated by the scene before them: countless fireflies, clear water, various mushrooms, and fruits that could glow they had never seen. Nightingale lamented that if the city of Neverwinter had such glowing fruits, the streets and alleys could be illuminated at night. Lightning was excited about taking some of the fruits and mushrooms back to grow, but she was even more eager to taste them. Agatha turned to Elena, inquiring if the drilling worms could swim, to which Elena shook her head, she didn't quite know either. The group could only proceed by following the flow of the river. Nightingale, observing the direction of the water, estimated that this underground river might lead to the southern hills. Lightning was puzzled, she had been to that area many times but recalled there weren't any rivers there. Where could all this water be ending up? Suddenly, there was a rustle ahead. Everyone drew their weapons. Nightingale used her abilities but detected no magical energy ahead. They advanced a few steps and discovered something looking like an egg. Elena gestured to the god punishment witches to move forward for a closer look. However, the thing looked disturbingly grotesque, causing Lightning to wonder about the size of the creature that could lay such an egg. Just as they were examining it, one of the god punishment witches sensed danger and plunged her sword into the egg. With a swift upward flick, the egg split open, spraying out some sort of fluid. To their astonishment, a demon emerged from inside. Then the entire egg shifted, transforming into a creature that began to climb onto the stone wall and escape. Nightingale quickly caught up with it, pulling out her dagger and stabbing it fiercely in the head. The group realized in horror that perhaps the demons were being spawned from these eggs. Agatha stared in shock at the demon's corpse, having never heard anything about this. From the look, it appeared that the demon was fully matured. As the group ventured further, they stumbled upon more eggs, however, each time finding different things inside. One of them even contained a human. This grim discovery made it clear that these eggs were using both demons and humans as prey. But how did these eggs capture them, and could it be that they had infiltrated the territory of Neverwinter? This question weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Suddenly, Nightingale sensed a magical reaction up ahead. Realizing it must be Fran, she quickly sprinted ahead, with the rest of the group quickly following. As Nightingale neared, it became increasingly difficult to see clearly. Just seconds later, multiple gunshots rang out. The group quickened their steps, and Lightning, drawing her pistol, flew towards Nightingale's location. Fortunately, Nightingale was unharmed. She then activated a magic stone for light and was standing over several dead demonic beasts. It's none other than the invisible mantis. Nightingale confidently tucked her pistol back into her belt, boasting that nothing could escape her eyes. She then patted Fran, who was tightly bound beside her. Fran wriggled and mumbled, her mouth apparently sealed. As Lightning checked the surroundings, she noticed a stone monument. Nightingale joined her, and it became apparent they had finally found the Snow Mountain ruins. The group caught up, and Nightingale explained what had happened. Fran had been captured by demonic beasts, and this was part of the ruins. However, the enemy might still be nearby. Together, they tore away the thing entrapping Fran. After rescuing Fran, the next step was to establish a defensive line by the First Army before proceeding further. When Fran is finally able to talk, everyone hears her warning to not look up. However, after hearing this, Lightning instinctively looked upwards. Above, in the dark cavern ceiling, a crimson eye appeared, followed by a second, a third, and then countless others. Countless eyes lit up the entire cavern, their eerie gaze fixed on lightning, causing the hairs on her back to stand on end. Meanwhile, above ground, Edith and Brian were still directing the First Army to establish defenses when Edith thought she heard something. Brian, however, heard nothing and assumed Edith was just a bit anxious, suggesting she take a rest. Edith smiled and shook her head. Seeing her smile, Brian, face slightly blushed and quickly changed the subject, asking where she thought the machine gun should be positioned. Edith pointed to a higher ground and said that gave them more strategic advantage. Suddenly, Edith noticed something strange. The grass on the ground seemed to be moving as they were being stepped on. Before she could turn to warn the soldiers, a swift swishing sound was followed by a gruesome sight. A soldier's head rolled off his shoulders, his smile still frozen on his face. Just a second ago he was having a good time with his friend, and now he's dead. Enemy attack! Edith finally shouted, and then yelled, "The enemy is invisible!" Almost immediately, several more soldiers were gruesomely beheaded. Realizing there was more than one, Edith threw a dagger in the direction of the fallen soldiers to gauge the attacker's position. The dagger was deflected. She then drew her sword and thrust it where she calculated was the attacker's position, felt that she had pierced something. She had aimed for what she figured was the enemy's abdomen. As she prepared to retreat, sensing imminent danger, she instinctively ducked, feeling something barely miss the back of her head, cutting off several strands of her hair in the process. Edith quickly fell back, realizing the enemy was likely armed with at least 2 weapons. She urgently called to the First Army soldiers to fire in her direction. The soldiers quickly turned around and a barrage of bullets soared where Edith was, revealing the form of a huge mantis as it was torn apart by gunfire. The demonic beast soon collapsed dead, but there were still several more of them nearby, continuing to inflict casualties among the First Army soldiers. Suddenly, several figures charged forward, slashing at the invisible mantis. Suddenly a burst of light flashed, revealing the creature's position briefly, and more god punishment witches appeared, swiftly charging at the remaining beasts. Edith breathed in relief as one of the god punishment witches extended a hand, asking if she was all right. The witch lamented that they were still too late. The witch advised Edith to retreat with the First Army and leave the demonic beasts to them. Edith asked how they were able to see the invisible enemies. It turned out that the god punishment stones could temporarily disrupt the enemy's invisibility. The witch explained that the effectiveness of the stones depends on factors like light, distance, and attention. Most stones only had a radius of maybe 2 meters or less, and these creatures are incredibly fast. It's very difficult to detect in such dim conditions. Edith noted that the speed, strength, and attack range of these demonic beasts were terrifying, too much for any normal human to react to in time. Brian, looking around at the fallen soldiers, cursed himself for not having barbed wire deployed sooner. The god punishment witches urged everyone to retreat quickly, as the previous noise had alarmed the entire snowy mountain. It was then that Edith realized the sounds she had heard were not hallucinations. The god punishment witch was surprised Edith had heard them too, considering that they had lost their sense of touch and taste, and their sight and hearing had become extremely better. It was unexpected that a mortal could also hear these sounds. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Edith hurriedly directed the First Army soldiers to ascend in order, with the god punishment witches remaining on guard. Margie then used her ability to transport everyone upwards, but just as they were moving, they suddenly heard intense gunfire. The faces of the group turned grim as they quickened their pace. As the group emerged from the cave, they were immediately greeted by soldiers frantically reloading their weapons, reporting that a swarm of demonic beasts was descending from the snowy mountain. Everyone looked up, as countless of them charging down. Edith suspected that the earlier sound might have been a call to summon these beasts. She recalled reading a book written by Roland about a peculiar type of sound in this world. Although humans can't hear them, they were crystal clear to certain creatures, which could even use it for unique communication within their species. It seemed they were now witnessing such a phenomenon. A soldier approached, reporting that Maisie had observed unusual demonic beast activity in the forest. Perhaps they were also coming toward the snowy mountain. Brian stood frozen, sweat beading on his forehead. Edith thought Brian was still too inexperienced. A commander should never show confusion or helplessness, especially in front of their subordinates. Acting quickly, Edith instructed Brian to rally the First Army stationed outside the mountain, gathering everyone at the cave entrance to form a defense line. At the same time, deploy all heavy machine guns. She then directed Maisie to fly back to Neverwinter and immediately to contact King Roland for reinforcements. They had enough supplies and ammunition for now, but they couldn't last very long. Given that the demonic beasts wasn't able to swim, Edith ordered them to not abandon their cement ships which moored outside. However, leave about 10 people on the ship to hold the demonic beasts at bay with the ships. Lastly, she ordered everyone to bury god punishment stones nearby to prevent any invisible mantis from ambushing them. Moreover, they had to continue sending the god punishment witches down to reinforce those already below. Gathering everyone together to locate the exploration team was crucial, and they needed to act swiftly. Edith suspected that the mysterious sound they heard was key to everything. Brian took a deep breath and quickly began executing Edith's orders. Meanwhile, underground, Agatha suddenly became nauseous, and what just happened was awful. Turned out, the group had entered the body of Fran, and Agatha described it as feeling like being stuffed into a sack full of stinky slime and then violently thrown against a wall multiple times. Nightingale, emerging from the haze, agreed that Agatha's description was painfully accurate. But had it not been for Fran leading them out, they would have been in grave danger. Fran cautiously asked if she had been too rough, only to make Agatha nauseous again with her breath. Lightning confirmed that being swallowed by a giant worm and emerging unscathed was an unprecedented experience. Elena rolled her eyes, telling everyone that she was jealous of them being able to smell the stench and feel the stickiness.
Hold up, wait a minute, something ain't right.
Anyway, Agatha coughed twice and managed to smile, choosing not to linger on the topic. Instead, she redirected the group's focus to what they needed to do next. The recent ordeal had left the witches feeling uneasy, haunted by the memory of countless crimson eyes above them and the deafening sound that had unleashed a swarm of hybrid demonic beasts rushing from the depths of the ruins toward them. Earlier, in that critical moment, Fran made the correct decision. She swallowed everyone except Nightingale into her stomach and turned to burrow into the cave wall. As her entire body was engulfed by the rock, the demonic beasts caught up and began viciously biting her body. Even with Nightingale providing cover, the number of enemies was overwhelming. Enduring intense pain, Fran continued to drill the cave for over 10 meters before forcefully rolling her massive body to crush the pursuing beasts. She then thrashed her tail against the cave ceiling, causing the rock above to collapse and seal the entrance, finally escaping. Fortunately, everyone emerged unscathed. Now that they had a moment to breathe, they finally had time to ask Fran what exactly had happened. Fran explained that the moment she had broken through the passage, the rock layer beneath her suddenly collapsed. She fell before she could react, she hit the bottom of the pit and then lost consciousness. When she woke up, she was being carried away by several invisible things and was quickly bound up. Luckily, she wasn't eaten right away. Meanwhile, in the cave, Fran began to explain what exactly had happened to her. When she had been captured and dragged here, she also instinctively looked up and locked eyes with a monstrous creature above. Only then did she realize how big the creature was. However, the smell of Fran's breath was indeed hard to bear. Agatha turned her head away before holding her breath and urged Fran to continue. Fran didn't know how to describe the creature. To her, it almost looked like a mass of squashed organs overlaid with a bunch of eyeballs. It was almost as if both were crudely assembled together. Hearing this, everyone began to ponder. After a brief moment, they realized that they should prioritize how to escape here first. Elena patted Fran, asking if she was still able to move. Fran shook her head, saying she was completely drained and needed food. But the group's combined rations weren't even enough to fill the gaps in her teeth. Elena suggested waiting for rescue, but Agatha pointed out that the cramped space and lack of oxygen wouldn't sustain them for a day. Moreover, the demonic beasts had already gathered outside, and the First Army was likely engaged in battle above them. Their small group had no chance of breaking out on their own. As for Fran, if they leave her here, she would have no way to resist. Nightingale turned away, didn't want to choose between the two, and decided to scout outside by herself. Fran then spoke up, telling them it's okay to leave her behind, since as a Takira witch, she had never feared sacrifice. However, she also remembered something inside her might still be of use to the group. She wiggled around, then writhed and slowly spit out several iron boxes covered in sticky saliva. Turned out, these were the First Army's encampment supplies. She swallowed them since they would be easier to transport. Upon opening the box, various tools such as shovels and pickaxes were found, and in one of the boxes, Agatha was able to find a few items that looked like items made by the chemical department. Agatha immediately recognized these were all explosives. She quickly showed it to everyone, explaining how they worked, which the god punishment witches immediately thought this one of Roland's most powerful weapons. To them, these items were capable of moving mountains and splitting the earth. Suddenly, Elena threw the pickaxe away. She didn't look very happy, and neither were the Takira witches behind her. Elena angrily questioned if no one ever thought that these explosives could have detonated inside Fran. Agatha calmly explained the ones they had seen were just experimental prototypes in the laboratory. She then pulled out a packet with copper tubes and thin cords, explaining that these needed to be inserted into the explosive. Without such preparations, ordinary impacts wouldn't set them off. Realizing her impulsiveness, Elena apologized for her outburst. Agatha waved it off, urging everyone to gather around again. Curious, the other Takira witches began examining the explosives, handling them like children. However, Agatha herself was not very familiar with these items. Just then, Lightning approached and explained that those marked with red were fuse detonators that needed to be lit, while those with blue markings were pulled detonators, activated simply by pulling the attached cord. There was also a type marked in yellow for electrical detonation, although they didn't seem to have it here. Agatha, impressed, asked how she knew this, to which Lightning replied that she always goes to check out First Army's newest weaponry. Quickly, they began brainstorming. They would bury the explosives at the entrance of the cave to blast a pathway, then carry Fran and retreat. If they encountered demonic beasts, they would continue to throw explosives behind them. Elena believed that if the explosives could hold off the enemies, they would be able to carry Fran. Fran tried to insist again that they could just leave her behind, but was quickly ignored. Although the Takira witches did not fear sacrifice, they absolutely could not abandon a sister. Agatha shook her head since igniting the explosives in such cramped space is also dangerous to them. However, if they moved to a more spacious cavern, the blast's effectiveness would be greatly diminished. Moreover, there were no firearms here, and there was no way they could fend off the remaining demonic beasts. They once again fell into silence until Nightingale appeared and sat on Fran, suggesting why not just get rid of the eye monster instead? Elena pointed out that they couldn't fly, perhaps forgetting about Lightning, but before Lightning could respond, Agatha interjected, noting that there were also demonic beasts nearby that could fly. Meanwhile, Lightning's mobility would be severely limited while carrying heavy loads, making her a target for the demonic beasts. Nightingale waved it off, telling them that she never planned to send Lightning in the first place. Instead, she will personally deliver the explosives into the monster's mouth. Agatha was stunned since Nightingale surely knew the monster could see through her ability. Nightingale merely smiled, telling her that while the monster could see her, the other demonic beasts could not. Reassuring everyone, as she began packing the explosives into her bag. Just as Agatha was about to say more, a familiar and unsettling sound came from behind them. Turning, they saw it was another devouring worm just like Fran. Clearly, the enemy had initiated an attack. Nightingale gestured to the others not to worry and once again disappeared into the mist. People may know her as Nightingale today, but from years ago her title had once echoed through the kingdom, and though some might have forgotten, she was once known as the Assassin in the Shadow. She gets into her ability, within the world of mist, and she quickly locates the monster. At the same time, they locked eyes. It's clear to her now that this monster was not a hybrid demonic beast, rather it was something else. Countless eyes turned towards Nightingale as she approached the monstrous creature, dodging through the demonic beasts that rushed in her direction, yet none of them could pinpoint her exact location. She leaped from one beast to another, drawing ever closer to her target. Suddenly, she sensed danger and quickly ducked. She dodged the attack and leaped back. Took her a second to realize it was the invisible mantis again. And it seems like these creatures could also see through her mist. Without hesitation, Nightingale charged towards the nearest mantis. It had been a long time since she'd felt the adrenaline rush of battling alone, a feeling that took her back to the days before she had met Wendy, Roland, and everyone else. Not long after, a small cut appeared on her arm, but she did not retreat. Instead, she continued to reap the lives of the mantis creatures while accumulating several wounds herself. Thankfully, her night suit, made of special material by Soraya, provided her with some protection. Memories of Wendy and Greycastle flooded her mind, realizing she wasn't truly alone. She drew her pistol, suddenly appearing in front of another mantis, and with a swift shot, blasted its head. She then fired more shots, killing more mantis. Clutching the wound on her abdomen, the pain causing her to break out in a cold sweat, there were still 5 more of them left. While battling the mantis, Nightingale pondered how this creature was able to command all of these demonic beasts. It has the ability to orchestrate their attacks with a level of coordination that she had never seen before. Such a creature was undoubtedly a significant threat to the city of Neverwinter and especially to Roland himself. By now, the pistol had run out of bullets and she wasn't given time to reload, leaving her no choice but to holster her pistol. She quickly dashed towards one of the mantis, maneuvered to its back, then dragged it into her mist. At the same time, one of the creature's tentacles lunged at Nightingale. However, this was all part of her plan. Pulling a mantis into the mist not only increased the rate of her magic consumption but also destabilized the mist world. However, this could be very useful. As the tentacle strike landed, it came in contact with the mist world, causing it to disorientate, causing it to accidentally take out the last of the mantises. Emerging from the mist world, the corpses of the mantises were strewn about, and the remaining demonic beasts began to fear Nightingale. The creature then let out a roar. Seeing the opportunity, she dashed forward. Up close, she didn't see a mouth but instead spotted an opening where an organ resembling a heart. She wondered if placing the explosive there could inflict significant damage. As the monster's tentacles continued their relentless assault, she dodged every attack while closing in on her target. With a sudden leap, she pulled out her backpack and stuffed the entire bag into the opening, swiftly pulling the detonator cord. She then kicked off the creature, using the recoil to propel herself backward, and plummeted towards an underground lake below. The monster let out another roar, and she suddenly thought what Roland had once said: a true warrior never looks back at the explosion. She let out a smile, however she was too tired even to turn her head. Then, the monster's body began to swell and a thunderous boom echoed as it was blown to pieces, its screams mingling with the sound of the explosion. The blast created a vortex in the lake, and using the last ounce of her strength, Nightingale re-entered the mist world to quickly surface and crawl out of the water. Let's just pause here for a second. Anyway, as she lay powerless on the shore before she fainted, a devouring worm burst through the wall. Moments later, the group watched with concern. Fran anxiously asked if Nightingale was alright, and Agatha carefully checked her, finding there were several injuries, and how Nightingale had depleted all her magic. Elena gently lifted the unconscious Nightingale, and the group prepared to make a swift exit. However, the writhing, twisted monster above them continued to emit painful howls. Clearly, it wasn't completely dead. However, Agatha doesn't want to risk anything right now, and they should escape first, and let the First Army would handle the rest. Lightning pouted, and slowly put her dagger back. Just then, as they were about to leave, giant skeletal hands surged from the water and dragged the monster down into the depths. However, the monster looked at the group one last time. The hatred was evident in its eyes. Meanwhile, outside, the demonic beasts finally began to retreat. The First Army soldiers cheered, one grumbling as he looked at his smoking heavy machine gun, saying how these beasts are not as fearsome as the God Punishment Army from the church. Another guy disagreed, telling him to not get ahead of himself. Without the weapon created by His Majesty, they would still be fighting demonic beasts with spears and arrows. Their captains ordered them to stop talking and began changing gun barrels and reloading their ammunition. Edith watched the soldiers and thought to herself that some of the demonic beasts clearly showed some level of intelligence. She saw many of the hybrid beasts and how they sat on the side, not charging at them but rather howling as if encouraging other demonic beasts to charge. At the thought of this, she began to wonder just what or who was commanding them. And what was the connection between the earlier sound and the demonic beasts? Edith couldn't figure it out, and perhaps only Roland could provide the answers. Her contemplations were interrupted by Brian, who hastily approached to pay his respects. Edith had been instrumental in their success, and Brian insisted on reporting the full details to the king. While Edith merely smiled, saying he didn't need to include her in the report. However, Brian didn't want to steal the credit, since, without Edith, things could end up very ugly. Seeing his persistence, Edith chose not to argue further. As Brian saluted once more before returning to his troops, Edith thought to herself why the king had chosen a patrol captain from a remote border town for such a significant military position. Perhaps, loyal to the king and inherently brave and upright were likely why Roland entrusted him with such responsibility. Since command skills and strategic insights could be developed over time, the character was far harder to alter. Edith then stretched her body, looking into the sunlight, thinking to herself that perhaps she had truly been accepted as part of the First Army. A few days later, back in Neverwinter, Roland had also received the latest updates. The news of Nightingale made him very concerned, but he was relieved to hear she was doing fine. Soraya even drew a portrait of Nightingale alongside the remains of the monster. Perhaps it was her way of signaling to him that she was all right. Roland studied the portrait. The monster was not just an ugly demonic beast. Not only did it wrap both humans and demons in these pods, but perhaps suggested it was trying to collect intel for both species. And the hatred it showed when it was dragged back into the water by skeletal claws, compared to before, almost seemed like it had two personalities. What was it trying to convey? Not long after, there was a knock on the door. Phyllis came to relay a message that Pasha wanted to discuss the exploration of the snowy mountains. Moments later, Roland also called Scroll over. As they entered the main hall, several god punishment witches greeted Roland with the highest form of respect, hands pressed to their chests. Roland immediately recognized them as Faldi and everyone else. However, they looked nothing like them in the dream world. Stepping into the hall, Pasha was already waiting on the screen. She bowed to Roland, expressing her gratitude for allowing the witches to enter the dream world and for the opportunity to explore the ruins. Roland tells her that doing so was also helping himself. He then asked Pasha if she had figured out how to retrieve the carriers from the ruins. Pasha outlined two methods, either physically moving the carriers back or bringing the instrument there. She preferred the latter. However, there was still the question of whether the Takira witches were still willing to fuse their souls with carriers. When Roland inquired whether Pasha had already selected candidates for this task, she reassured him that there was no need to worry. Everyone knew that the carriers could manipulate the magic cores, and the devouring worms could help accelerate the construction of defensive lines. As long as it benefited the Divine War, the Takira witches would not hesitate. He then shared the intelligence he had gathered about the monster with Pasha, seeking her insights. Shortly after, Celine and Alethea joined them, and after a long silence, they agreed with Roland's suspicions. This creature was neither a demonic beast nor a demon. Instead, Lady Natalia also depicted a similar skeletal creature in the third painting. Perhaps this was the last unknown civilization. Roland had anticipated this outcome. The goal of exploring the snowy mountains was to grab intel for this unknown civilization. Through some fragmented memories from Zero, he had glimpses of similar records, but with the confirmation of the Takira witches, he felt more confident. He pondered why the demonic beasts were listening to the monster's command. Could it be that these beasts were also a part of this hidden civilization? If that's the case, why didn't the enemy simply amass the demonic beasts and obliterate humanity and demons in one fell swoop? Yet, they only seemed to come out during the month of the demons. He guessed that only when the Divine War started, then he'd get his answer. Regardless, their ultimate goal remained the same. It was to defeat the enemy altogether. Pasha paused but agreed with Roland. However, Roland thought that since they identified the adversary as a hidden civilization, it seemed appropriate to give it a name. Pasha wasn't convinced that naming was important. After all, people refer to demons as demons because that is the most common term, though they had been called by other names in the past. Roland, however, smiled and explained that a fitting name was vital to their morale. The more sinister the name, the more it would ignite a spirit of resistance among the people. Pasha blinked her big eyes as Roland suggested calling them sea monsters, prompting a moment of silence in the room. Alethea couldn't help but murmur that she thought the third border town was already a terrible name, and now there was an even worse one. Pasha quickly tapped her on the head with her tentacle, and hurriedly apologized, saying the name was fine, though her tone was clearly reluctant. Suddenly, Scroll coughed and suggested to Roland, why not call them deep-sea demons instead? After all, the concept of demons was already deeply ingrained in people's minds, and since these beings lived in the deep sea, it would make things simpler. Roland shrugged, somewhat reluctantly, but it is what it is. Let's return to Lorca. Right now, she found herself in a forest, however, because the month of the demons just ended. Only the barren branches remained on the trees. She transformed back into her human form and put on some clothes. With her ears perked up, she heard sounds not far away. Soon, she discovered a port, the territory of Greenwater Harbor. Lorca boldly walked in and quickly spotted someone dressed like a soldier from the First Army. She hurriedly asked them where are they stationed, wanting to find Ashes, but then, turning her head, she caught sight of someone. Ashes smiled at her, having already anticipated her arrival. Lorca's ears twitched and wondered how she knew. Ashes, smiling, explained that Lorca reminded herself of years ago. While Lorca was naturally inclined towards battle, Ashes was driven by vengeance. Anyway, Ashes wanted to take Lorca to explore the town a little bit. Lorca was curious about whom Ashes sought vengeance against. Turned out that it was the church. However, Ashes later followed up saying how she found more important things in life, which was Tilly. Ashes's tone softened when she spoke of Tilly. Lorca, in her mind, thought that this person named Tilly must have been very important to Ashes. As they ventured into town, she observed many people helping the Sand People build houses. She was quite surprised and thought these people were sent by Roland, but Ashes corrected her. They were workers who volunteered to come here, since working here also earned much higher wages, and many had applied, filling the municipal hall. Lorca, unfamiliar with the term municipal hall, grew even more concerned. With so many Sand People relocating and the king not using them as labor, she wondered what was really going on. Ashes quickly explained that most people were heading to Endless Cape, where Roland planned to build a new city, and a lot of Sand People were heading there. Although Lorca trusted Ashes, she couldn't help but doubt the feasibility of building a city on barren land, since Endless Cape is known for being completely empty and not suitable for living. Ashes followed up saying as for those who did not go, they could stay here and do whatever they could to help. End of the day, no one will be hungry. Ashes smiled and said that perhaps this was also what Tilly wanted to see, even though it was her seemingly unreliable brother who made it happen. When Lorca learned that Roland intended to extract black water in the Endless Cape, she swished her tail, questioning why it wouldn't be better to just purchase it from Iron Sand City. Ashes shook her head, she didn't know the reason either. She is just following Tilly's order, which was to assist Roland. As they continued to walk through the city, a young girl not far from them waved excitedly at Lorca, and her parents also smiled kindly at her. Lorca was slightly surprised, however she smiled back at them, whispering, "This place really is different." Throughout her journey here, the people never showed any signs of shock or disgust at her skin color, or even her ears and tail. Ashes then brought up Maisie, who had a similar ability as Lorca, telling her that Maisie could transform into an even more terrifying creature than her. In the entire Grey Castle, no one will ever discriminate against a witch. Hearing this, made Lorca ponder if this was where she could truly be herself. Thinking about this, she asked Ashes if she was the strongest witch here. Ashes stroked her chin thoughtfully and replied that it depended on whether if she carried the stone of God punishment. Without the stone, there were several members of the witch union she would likely lose to. Since several of them have their ability evolved, she can't just win by strength and speed. For instance, Leaf could control entire forests, making her unbeatable in her domain. Similarly, Anna, even if not super skilled in combat, her ability is extremely deadly and powerful. More importantly, she was Roland's darling. Lorca's eyes sparkled upon knowing there were so many powerful witches. Ashes then talked about Nightingale, whose abilities were the most mysterious. Ashes advised Lorca not to seek her out for a duel. Lorca silently repeated these names to herself, eager to meet them. As for Maisie, whom Ashes had mentioned earlier, she also advised Lorca to not fight her. Those who had done so had ended up very unlucky, and injuring her could provoke the wrath of the entire witch union. Lorca was startled by the description of Maisie, thinking she must be a very terrifying witch, perhaps even a ruling member of the witch union. Curious, Lorca asked Ashes what if she carried the stone. Ashes then asks what Lorca thinks about someone who possessed speed and strength comparable to an extraordinary witch, as well as almost immortal, who can't feel pain and could rapidly recover from injuries. Hearing this, Lorca widened her eyes in disbelief. Ashes had only met Phyllis once, during a sword training session where she gave her some advice after seeing her swinging her sword. Afterward, she noticed her movements were smoother. Clearly, Phyllis was very adept in combat. This made Lorca realize just how powerful someone had to be to offer such valuable insights after just one observation. In her mind, Phyllis was now the strongest person in Neverwinter, and she was even more excited about this journey. Ashes then revealed that there were over 100 witches just like Phyllis in Neverwinter. Lorca's ears perked up. Ashes gave her a thumbs up, telling her to keep her spirit up. Moments later, Andrea came by, laughing heartily. She tells Lorca that asking Ashes about complex matters was pointless, joking that her head was full of muscles. Lorca was still interested in learning about Roland's plan and ideas, since her father had once said that learning something new would help her improve her combat skills as well. Andrea, with a shrug, wasn't sure if that was the case. Either way, she began to explain why Roland didn't just buy black water from Iron Sand City directly. If they used gold to buy black water, the city of Neverwinter would be trading a portion of its wealth for the goods. And if this trade continued for 20 years, Roland would lose a lot of gold with little else changing. Lorca didn't understand why Andrea said lose. In her view, expending substantial manpower and resources on extraction was the real cost. Andrea shook her head, picked up a stick, and started drawing in the dirt to explain further. The Sand People who had moved were now part of Grey Castle. They needed daily necessities and resources from the city of Neverwinter, and the money they generated would be used to purchase these. Eventually, the money flow back to Roland. Over time, the circulation of assets would increase, and the initial investment would not be lost but rather continue to circulate within Grey Castle. Lorca thought about it and disagreed. The money might not always be in Neverwinter, but rather be different part of the kingdom. Andrea smiled and kept explaining that Roland had always considered the entire Grey Castle as one territory. Regardless of where the wealth circulated to within the kingdom, it was still his. Lorca thought, isn't that what all rulers and kings think? Then Andrea asked Lorca about when their clan was in charge, and whether they could control all of the other clans. Lorca shook her head. Even in Iron Sand City, her clan wasn't the only clan in charge. She quickly realized what Andrea was trying to say. Whether it was nobles, other kings, or chiefs, no one would treat another's territory as their own territory, even if it's the same kingdom. Andrea playfully patted Lorca on the shoulder, teasing that she was smart and should spend less time with Ashes, or she might become as stupid as she is. Since Roland had absolute control over the entire kingdom, the massive changes in the kingdom all credit to similar policies. Lorca looked at Andrea, surprised that this beautiful, blonde woman was answering her questions so thoroughly. It made Lorca wonder if Andrea had always wanted to share these insights but never had anyone to discuss them with. Andrea continued, stating that politics were more complex than just fighting. Roland gained not just wealth, but also their allegiance. She explained that as the Sand People migrated to Grey Castle, they would start new lives, gradually adapting to their new surroundings, continually learning, exchanging labor for goods, and no longer having to fight over land and resources. Eventually, they would truly become citizens of Grey Castle, which would continue to strengthen under Roland's leadership. This was why Roland's vision extended beyond merely acquiring black water. Lorca nodded and thought to herself that Andrea didn't hesitate to share the king's plan with her, maybe not necessarily out of trust, but she knew no one could stop these changes. Hearing these policies only made her more curious about this king, or as the Sand People would call him, their great chieftain. Lorca bowed to Andrea, expressing that she felt her combat skills had strengthened. After saying this, Lorca had already walked away, eager to start training again. Watching Lorca leave, Andrea couldn't help but smile, thinking to herself that Lorca and Ashes really were quite alike in their simplicity. 2 days later, Lorca was ready to head over to Neverwinter. At the port, and the witches bid farewell to Lorca. Meanwhile, on the other side, in a mansion, Otto's maid informed him that a guest had arrived. The man who entered removed his hood. Without wasting time, Otto opened a stone door, which he said was leading to the rear garden, which served as a reliable escape route. Hill was very cautious. He threw down a coin and listened for a moment before nodding in approval. He instructed Otto to send secret letters for any future communications. Otto on the other side thought it was still dangerous even with secret letters, especially since any leak of information from the palace would lead to immediate suspicion towards the three major families, particularly how their relationship with the new king had changed dramatically compared to when they were just children. Hill then asked if Otto knew if their king had new plans. Otto spoke gravely. He revealed that Anpian was preparing to attack the church to avenge his father. Upon hearing this news, Hill was not particularly surprised. Otto followed up saying, despite many ministers advising against it, the king had resolved to proceed. The army had already started requisitioning grain, and Otto predicted that they would march as soon as the heavy snow had completely melted. By then, the royal knights, along with Duke Kabu who rules the western region, would set out on the campaign. It was then that Hill realized why the price of porridge had recently increased by a copper coin. Otto also learned from merchants returning from the west that many refugees had appeared near the old holy city. Perhaps something had happened in Hermes. Hill nodded, as this info should be sent to Neverwinter as soon as possible. Otto hesitated and became much more serious as he addressed the second matter. He recalled that during last week's court session, their nation's foreign minister expressed concerns that Roland had not held a coronation ceremony and heard rumors that many nobles in the Grey Castle were against his ruling. Given the hostility between the two nations, the minister suggested they should secretly support those nobles. Hill's expression turned grave, curious about King Anpian's response. Turned out, the king did not reply immediately, but he seemed quite interested in the idea. Otto didn't know why he felt compelled to share these matters with Hill, especially as their nation's relationship had deteriorated. His family had served the royal family for generations, yet he could not bring himself to accept the new king's policies, particularly how Anpian aimed to kill all of the witches. And this might put Andrea in danger. He knew too well that Andrea was not like those pure ones from the church. However, his attempts to persuade the king only alienated him further. Whenever Otto looked at the young king now, he no longer felt the same respect he had with the old king, and their friendship seemed to fading away. Hill nodded, reassuring Otto that the plan against Roland would not succeed. Otto hesitated, his cheeks reddening as he asked for updates about Andrea. Hill explained that Andrea had first returned to Slumbering Isle and had recently come back to Neverwinter. With a smile, Hill told Otto not to worry since Andrea was in good hands. Their conversation drifted to less serious matters until they were interrupted by a discordant argument outside. Soon, both turned towards the door. Otto sent a maid downstairs to check on the disturbance, thinking perhaps someone had drunk too much, just as he tried to learn more about Andrea's situation. However, Hill interrupted him and leaned quietly against the door. Hill heard noises, armor clanking, iron boots stomping the floor, and sword hilts colliding with the floor and furniture. These people clearly were not drunkies, these were armed men. The maid never returned to the room, and that's not a good sign. He didn't want Hill to get the wrong idea, so he tried to assure Hill that it wasn't him. Hill quickly walked towards the secret passage leading to the back garden, telling Otto to not worry as he trusted him. Hill knew he needed to leave now, telling Otto to leave with him. However, he was prepared to hold off the people to ensure Hill's safe departure. Hill urged him again, since this is not within Otto's family territory, but Otto believed he wasn't the target, since he hadn't shared his contacts with Roland or his efforts to save witches with anyone else. Staying behind would allow him to explain himself better and ensure Hill's safer escape. Hill let out a sigh and wished Otto good luck. Quickly he entered the secret passage. Moments later, the door was kicked open, and a squad of fully armed knights crowded in. Without a word of explanation, they seized Otto. Otto angrily demanded to know if they were aware they were violating an earl's territory and accused them of rebellion. The bald leader of the knights smirked coldly, retorting that it was not they, but Otto, who was plotting a rebellion. Despite the accusations, Otto stood firm, shouting back that it was nothing but slander. The soldiers, ignoring Otto's protests, tell him that he will have to explain everything to the king himself. Otto was arrested and didn't get to see the king until 2 days later. During this time, Otto protested by refusing to eat, continually demanding to see Anpian. When Anpian finally appeared, he didn't seem pleased. Anpian only wanted to tell Otto to eat well, and was about to leave. Otto, grasping the bars of his cell, demanded to know why this was happening and where his family was. Anpian didn't answer these questions right away. Instead, he informed Otto that this was the palace dungeon, and the cell was built to the standards of a duke's residence. Otto then tried to explain, but Anpian cut him off with a cold smirk, gripping the bar, and shouted to him that he didn't want to listen to any of his lies. Anpian revealed that he had spent months tracing the faintest clues about witches and was shocked to discover Otto's involvement. All of Otto's dealings, meeting York, rescuing witches, and aiding their escape. To Anpian, these actions were utter betrayals. In his eyes, witches deserved to be in hell. And the letter Roland wrote to him is nothing but a betrayal of their alliance. Anpian pointed out that their past friendship was the only thing sparing Otto from the gallows. Regarding the three families, Anpian is still in need of them, however, that's not for long. Otto felt a chill descend upon him as he listened to Anpian's harsh words, seeing a viciousness in his eyes, and the red-armored soldiers that Otto had never seen before. He realized that since the old king's death, the three families had completely lost Anpian's trust. As for Otto's father, he was unharmed and attended the court session as usual. Before leaving, he turned to Otto, advising him to stop his hunger strike and warned that if Otto continued to be obstinate, Anpian might resort to more drastic measures. Meanwhile, back at Grey Castle, somewhere in the Northern Territories, snowflakes still floating in the chilly air. A group of soldiers huddled around, some keeping watch, others warming themselves by a fireplace. The captain of this squad, peering through binoculars towards the distant snow-capped mountains, checked his rifle and reminded him of the battle just a few months ago that still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the veiled witch whose terrifying powers had brutally slain nearby soldiers. Despite knowing she was the enemy, witnessing her struggle against countless bullets had left him with a deep unease. If not for his loyalty to the king, he might have already left the army to pursue a simpler life. A soldier behind him prepared to fetch some firewood. However, it was still their duty time, and everyone was supposed to remain on post. Meanwhile, an older soldier reassured him with a chuckle, saying no one would mind given the bitter cold. After all, several months had passed since the last sighting of the church's forces. Convinced by his words, the captain nodded and sent him to help gather firewood more quickly. He then lifted his binoculars again, scanning the snowy terrain. This time, he spotted figures moving in the distance. Turning around, he shouted to alert the others, and all the soldiers gathered around him. He carefully wiped his binoculars and looked again to confirm. Indeed, there were people approaching their position. As the sound of the horn echoed across the plains, everyone got to their positions. The entire squad quickly arranged themselves into combat formation. A younger soldier asked if the approaching group could be from the church. The older soldier said it had to be the people from Hermes, although he wasn't sure if there were going to be those terrifying god punishment warriors this time. The captain loaded the machine gun. As the distance closed to about 1,000 meters, he noticed something odd. These people didn't seem to be knights. They wore no armor and their clothing was thin and ragged, looking more like refugees to him. But there's also a chance that they were god punishment warriors in disguise. However, he knew if he couldn't confirm these people's identities if they came too close to the post, they would surely be shot. He's also not certain if these people carried those pills that would make them frenzied. Rushing forward, he could clearly see that each person appeared extremely weak. He was almost certain that these people were refugees. He shouted for them to stop advancing or they would be shot. Instead of heeding his warning, the group, clearly spotting him, quickened their pace with excited expressions and waved their hands, seemingly relieved. The captain fired 2 warning shots into the sky, but this had no effect on the advancing group. The older soldier joined him, telling the captain that these people wouldn't know what a gun was, and they both continued to yell, but it was too late. The group had already entered the perimeter and crossed the wooden stakes. Shots rang out from behind, and several of them were shot. Alright guys, you can't have war crimes if the Geneva the Geneva Convention was not yet established. Anyway, the group finally halted. The captain quickly turned around and yelled at the man to cease fire. All of the people suddenly knelt down. Though visibly frightened, they did not turn around and flee. When asked where they were from, one of the people said they were from Hermes. However, they denied being followers of the church, saying that they had been deceived by the church this entire time. People began pleading for some food. With hands clasped together, they appeared desperate, and a woman shouted about her child being on the brink of death, while another person said he hadn't eaten for 3 days. The captain was moved and reached into his pocket for some rations, but an older soldier grabbed his arm, whispering urgently that these people were from Hermes, thus they have to be followers of the church and thus their enemies. The other soldiers gathered around. Some even said that these very people might have crafted the weapons and armor used by the church's armies. Perhaps some of them were part of the Judgment Army. The captain shook his head, urging his men to remember the time before the king came down to the border town. Back then, many of them had been deceived by the church, however, His Majesty never abandoned them. He argued that they should not abandon these people now. While those guilty of crimes must be held accountable, the first step should be to provide food and then individually interrogate them, as this is what the king had taught them. Despite some hesitation among the troops, the captain reminded them of the king's words in his book, stating that Grey Castle was a united community and that all who pledged allegiance to Grey Castle were its citizens. They should not reject these people or ignore their suffering, as doing so would go against the king's wishes. The soldiers fell silent for a moment until the older soldier smiled, finally understanding why Nail was chosen to be the captain. However, Nail still wanted to know what exactly had happened in Hermes. From the refugees, they learned that the cathedral in the new holy city had collapsed. According to the refugees, a massive sinkhole had suddenly opened underground, swallowing the entire building. No one knew exactly what had happened, and the area was now sealed off by the church. Rumors were rampant that the divine beings had abandoned them, leading many to flee Hermes. However, the church's forces relentlessly pursued the deserters. Their group used to be in the hundreds, and now only a few of them managed to make it here. Nail digested this information. Clearly, this is good news, and perhaps they could seize Hermes in no time. Meanwhile, on top of a giant wall, Tucker, dressed in the brand new pope attire, became a temporary pope. Looking into the distance, he had anticipated that demonic beasts would devastate Hermes and had prepared to die here. Yet, surprisingly, barely any demonic beasts attacked. What's worse is that no one had predicted the sudden collapse of the cathedral, causing nearly all of the church's leadership to disappear. To him, this was worse than losing the war to Grey Castle. Could it be that the divine being had truly abandoned them? Behind him, a woman spoke. It was Felina, the commander of the Judgment Army, who reported that the forces sent to chase the fleeing refugees had returned. Tucker knew this won't be good news. He was right, many troops had disbanded during the pursuit, with some choosing to flee as well. Felina, visibly frustrated, calling them traitors. Tucker let out a sigh and asked how many of them were left. Felina reported precisely 564 soldiers. Tucker turned around and decided that they should be heading east and build a new holy city there. Felina was shocked and wondered who would defend against the demonic beasts if they left. Tucker believed that preserving their strength was crucial now. To him, perhaps only when the demonic beasts rampaged through the 4 great kingdoms would people remember and turn to the church again. Tucker, being a higher-up, clearly knew about the demons. However, he avoided bringing them up, as those remaining were the church's most loyal followers, and the best he could do for now is to offer them was take them far away from the battlefield. Felina shook her head and then told Tucker that those determined to stay were devout believers, and all of them were ready to die for the holy city. They likely would not agree to abandon Hermes. Tucker smiled at her, while earnestly saying that it doesn't matter where they are, since whatever they are standing on, that is the holy city. Hoping Felina could persuade them, he paused briefly before adding that this was also his command as the acting pope. Just then, the gray sky brightened with a tinge of brightness as the sun emerged, signaling the official end of the months of the demon. Tucker smiled again, instructing Felina to begin preparations for their departure within 3 weeks. Felina, much more relieved, hurried to make arrangements. As Felina walked away, Tucker remained behind. He removed his crown, placing it atop the wall, then climbed the city wall to gaze into the distance at the setting sun. Closing his eyes, he leaned forward and jumped off. The sound made Felina halt and turn back, and Tucker was no longer there. Maybe in Tucker's mind, he lost hope, or perhaps to him, only by doing this, could make everyone truly abandon Hermes. Back in Neverwinter, Roland gathered everyone in the main hall where a large banner hung on the wall, inscribed with Spring Cultivation Campaign. Roland started off by saying the use of the term campaign might have puzzled some, but Roland explained that the upcoming efforts were crucial to the successful implementation of this year's strategic plans. He emphasized the importance of ensuring that no one in Grey Castle would go hungry, a goal he had managed to achieve over the past 3 years. Stability in the kingdom, he argued, depended on everyone being well fed. This will be an assessment of everyone here whether they can meet the standards necessary to manage different areas of the territory. Roland then unveiled the criteria for this year: 50,000 hectoliters of grain. This number surprised many. For most of them, this almost sounded fantastical. Roland followed up and explained that with the use of the second-generation golden seed, the newest variety of seed being tested in the fields, yields had doubled compared to the first generation, producing so much that the tip of the wheat was heavy enough to bend the stalks. Everyone was aware of how high the yields from the first-generation golden seed fields had been, and the idea of doubling such a number seemed almost miraculous. Roland then allowed Leaf to explain further. To make things simple, the second-generation golden seeds could only be planted once. The seeds were engineered using magic to absorb nutrients from deeper layers of soil, which also meant they required more fertilization as well. After Leaf's explanation, Edith was the first to raise a question. She was curious whether the wheat catalyzed by magic was safe for consumption by ordinary people. Roland patiently clarified that although the seeds were developed by Leaf using her ability and were modified by magic, they did not contain magic themselves, making them safe for consumption by ordinary people. He reassured everyone by sharing that his own recent meals had all been sourced from seeds. The policy will be mostly the same for this year as well. Farmers can still sell their excess grain to the municipal hall. Shortly after, Spear, raising a practical concern, asked if the second gen would produce too much surplus. If, like before, all surplus grain were to be bought by the municipal hall, it could put a lot of financial pressure on the municipal hall. She specifically mentioned the situation in her territory, Dragon Fall Ridge, which had only 10,000 residents. She questioned whether such a small population also needed so much as well. Roland nodded and explained that any surplus grain would be stored somewhere. He spoke with gravity, emphasizing that these reserves were crucial for the upcoming divine war. After the meeting came to an end, Roland arrived at the dock. He was warmly greeted by the returning group of witches from the snowy mountains. Among them was Nightingale, who flew into his arms with a light chuckle, while whispering, "I'm back." Roland gently admonished her not to be so reckless in the future. Nightingale nodded, then shook her head, saying how she couldn't turn blueprints into reality like Anna, and that supporting Roland in her own way was all she could offer. However, staying by Roland's side is the most important thing to her, so she promises that she won't put herself in danger again. Hearing this, made Roland blush a little. As Nightingale's figure faded, other members then approached Roland. Lightning, with a wave of her arm, jumped onto Roland enthusiastically. Even Agatha smiled softly as she gave him a gentle hug. However, the god-punished witches looked at him earnestly. It was clear they were all aware of the dream world. Despite knowing that they all are girls from the inside, it was still a peculiar feeling for Roland to be gazed upon by these tall and muscular male bodies. As the group busily unloaded the ship, Roland found himself encircled by the Takira witches. Back in his office, Roland found Nightingale already waiting for him at his desk, having also heard about the dream world and how the Takira witches could enter it. Roland briefly explained how it worked, but Nightingale didn't respond, rather pouted and provocatively placed her bare foot on his knee. Roland looked at her and yelled that there was no way he would ever allow Nightingale to turn herself into a god punishment witch, just so that she could enter the dream world. Despite her attempts to explain, Roland didn't want to listen. He didn't believe the dream world would exist forever, and moreover, it was being eroded by some mysterious force. How could he allow Nightingale to live encased in a body forever devoid of sensation? Nightingale, head bowed and pouting, was at a loss for words. She sighed, feeling it unfair that others could access a place she believed only Roland could enter. Roland chuckled, gently laughed, and explained that the sacrifices the witches made were unimaginable. Enduring centuries without physical sensations was hard to bear, and Nightingale should not envy them. Placing his hand over hers, he reminded her of her promise to stay by his side for life, playfully adding that he didn't want a muscular and bearded god punishment warrior constantly by his side. Embarrassed, Nightingale turned her head away, looking quite adorable. Seizing the lighter mood, Roland then asked if she'd like a cup of chaos drink, to which she quickly turned back and nodded vigorously. As they sipped their drinks, Roland thanked Nightingale for her role in keeping everyone safe. He stressed without Nightingale, everyone would be in danger. Chewing her dried fish, she waved it off and said it was nothing. Roland thought otherwise, since losing the exploration team would be a detrimental loss to Grey Castle, and to him. Telling Nightingale that she was as indispensable as Anna was, hearing this, made Nightingale blush a little, and she quickly changed the subject and asked what Roland meant by his dream world eroding. He tells her not to worry, since whatever happens in the dream world will not affect him. However, he was curious about the deeper mysteries it held, especially concerning a certain textbook on Olympiad mathematics. Initially, many books he encountered in the dream world had been blank, since he never read these books before. However, what should have been blank was now filled with content, despite he never having read it. He wondered if this meant that all the things he hadn't seen before would eventually restore themselves in the dream world. His thoughts deepened, and he became so engrossed that he didn't notice his hands had unwittingly moved to Nightingale's legs. A couple of minutes passed, and it was Nightingale's voice that brought him back to reality. Looking down, he realized where his hands were. He quickly retracted his hands, and Nightingale, slightly blushing, wondered if she should go take a shower first. Roland felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He didn't mean to do it, he was too engrossed thinking about the dream world, but the feeling wasn't too bad after all. Just as he was trying to figure out how to explain himself, there was a knock on the office door, and Nightingale dived into the mist. As Agatha entered the office, she noticed something odd about Roland's demeanor but quickly focused on the matter at hand. She informed him that all the materials had been transferred to the third border town and asked if he wanted to watch. Roland nodded and got up. However, Agatha paused and looked at him with concern, asking if he was feeling unwell. She heard some unusual tone in Roland's voice, which prompted her worry about his health. Given that the month of the demons had passed but it's still really cold outside, illnesses were rampant and Roland might get sick. She wanted to call over Lily first before they headed over to the third border town. Nightingale, who had been standing quietly behind Roland, let out a soft chuckle in the mist. Soon, following Agatha and the Takira witch, Roland arrived at the underground cave. Before him stood some familiar faces. Including Phyllis, all of them have been into the dream world a couple of times now, and they were very friendly. They greeted him, then guided them deeper into the cavern. Alethea had heard that Roland intended to keep those bug-like creatures underground and even planned to try taming them. Although she acknowledged Roland's bravery, she warned him of the dangers. While mentioning how his curiosity might lead to disaster, especially since these creatures were remnants of their deep-sea enemies which they still have very little intel on. This was precisely why he wanted the Takira witches to guard the place. After all, these captured bugs had no aggressive tendencies nor could they dig holes. They could be contained in a single sealed room. Moreover, according to Agatha's observations, these creatures lacked self-awareness, operating purely on instincts like feeding and reproducing. The possibility of the massive eye monster that managed to escape and regain control over them was unlikely. The chance of them even reaching the city of Neverwinter is even more slim. What Roland is doing reminds her of the old Witch Federation's researchers, which Alethea called crazy people. Hearing this, Agatha pouted. However, she didn't argue. Pasha quickly pulled Alethea behind, telling her that Celine, also a researcher herself, would be upset by such comments. She hurriedly explained to both of them that Alethea was just concerned about the potential dangers the creatures might pose, urging them not to take it personally. Roland was well aware of these concerns himself, but from the reports he had read, it was too important for him to abandon this project. He wasn't upset, and changed the topic, saying he wanted to go and see the creatures for himself. They walked through the long cave and down a narrow corridor. Pasha introduced this new cultivation chamber opened up by Fran, where mushrooms brought from the ruins were being grown. She confirmed with Roland again whether he wanted to cultivate both mushrooms and the creatures here. Agatha explained that the large mushrooms were precisely the creatures' food. If they could grow well here, they could easily sustain a large population of the creatures. Roland felt somewhat regretful that the mushrooms from the snowy mountain ruins contained toxins, otherwise, these massive mushrooms could have been an alternative to high-protein food. Phyllis asked Roland why he needed so many of these creatures. Roland smiled and suggested that they might be very useful for the development of Neverwinter. As they walked further, they observed the creatures munching on the mushrooms. Suddenly, after Roland nodded to her, Agatha used her powers to shoot 2 ice spikes, pinning one of the creatures to a mushroom. The group then dragged the carcass over, and a white fluid began to ooze out. Agatha then made an ice sword and sliced it into the creature's belly. Pointing to the fluid, she explained that this sticky substance had some preservative qualities, although it smelled bad and wasn't edible. But that wasn't the main point. Agatha then reached into the creature's body, pulling out a sticky green organ that looked somewhat like a gallbladder. She then sliced open and dropped a few of the green fluid out. Soon, when mixed with the white fluid on the ground, it transformed into a gel-like substance. Phyllis was surprised, but Roland was very excited to see it with his own eyes. He patted the substance and told everyone that this was what he called a biological rubber, which is the same stuff that trapped Fran. This was the first time for them to see a rubber. Turned out, Agatha's experiment revealed that the mixture of fluids from the creature's organs and its stomach fluid could rapidly solidify. Sylvie's ability helped them quickly discover this. In fact, Roland had been sending people to search for gelatinous plants. All he needed was one sample, and then Leaf would be able to produce it in large quantity. However, no such plant had been found in the territory of Grey Castle or any other nearby kingdoms. This unexpected discovery from their recent expedition to Snowy Mountains was why, despite the risks, Roland was determined to breed these creatures. Pasha and Alethea began to understand the potential. Pasha even thought the substance could be used to make fishing nets and ropes, although Alethea felt it was too soft for ropes. She then pointed at Roland, saying how she believed the king's intentions went beyond merely catching fish. She then became more serious, reminding Roland that right now, he represented more than just Grey Castle. This slightly shocked Roland. He hadn't expected Alethea, who had always doubted his leadership, to figure out his intention, but it seemed like she fully trusted his leadership now. Roland patiently explained that they would soon know the broad uses of the substance. Pasha then raised a question: without the massive-eyed monster controlling them, how could they make the creature extract the fluid willingly? Surely they couldn't just kill them every time? Agatha wiped her hands, noting that this was a direction for future research. For now, they would rely on mass breeding to address the issue. As Roland was preparing to leave, Pasha let out 2 god punishment witches, Jasmine and Rhonda. They were to undergo soul transition to become new devouring worm hosts. However, before this transition, Pasha requested that Roland allow the 2 of them to experience the dream world so they could experience their real body for one last time. Hearing this, Roland nodded without hesitation. 2 days later, a warship slowly departed from the docks of Neverwinter. On deck, something was securely tied down, surrounded by soldiers of the First Army. On the dock, Roland thought about the upcoming transition. Once the instrument reached the Snowy Mountain, the 2 witches would undergo their transformation. Then they will have a total of 3 devouring worms including Fran. This would undoubtedly accelerate both defensive line preparations and city construction, which was ostensibly good news, yet Roland didn't find much joy. Reflecting on their last visit to the dream world, Jasmine and Rhonda, back in their real bodies, were quite lively and cheerful. Roland and Phyllis took them around to play and eat, allowing them to experience once again the sensations of their original bodies. Who would have known that they had long since given up their own bodies, resolutely sacrificing their lives to combat demons, a choice they had made 400 years ago. After leaving the dream world, Roland wanted to offer some comfort but found himself at a loss for words. Ironically, it was he who ended up being comforted. He vividly remembered their words and the look in their eyes as they smiled at him, saying, "Thank you, we have no regrets." Taking a deep breath and looking towards the distant ship that was now far away, Phyllis approached Roland and asked if he was okay. He suppressed his thoughts, took another deep breath, and asked, "Is there really no way to sever the consciousness after merging with the host bodies?" Phyllis seemed to understand what he was getting at and explained earnestly. Telling him that god punishment witches differ from the original hosts. When inside a god punishment warrior's body, others call it merging, but it's more like control. However, once inside an original host, the connection becomes very tight, and they can no longer separate their consciousness or souls and will be locked inside that body forever. So far, no one has been able to change this. Although they still have their magical energy, which helps them to move around inside the massive body. Roland looked up at the sky, pondering the possibility of one day finding a way to return their souls to the dream world. Phyllis looked at him and, after a moment, let out a smile while saying hopefully that day won't be too long. Lorca had been on the ship for several days, and this was her first sight of a forest blanketed in heavy snow. Everything here was so unique to her. She still remembered the first time she got on the ship. Following Andrea, she was curious about how the ship could move without wind. Upon learning that there was a machine on board that continuously boiled water, she wanted to know why boiling water could propel the ship, a question even Andrea couldn't answer. She tells her that only Anna and Roland could answer that. This was the second time Lorca had heard someone mention Anna. She remembered Ashes telling her that Anna was among the top 3 strongest witches in Neverwinter. However, Andrea felt that rankings of combat ability were irrelevant. She spoke at length, but the gist was that Anna was the source of all power in Neverwinter. Lorca listened intently, and then Andrea shared a secret about how Ashes had once been defeated by a regular person. The weapon he used to defeat Ashes was forged by Anna. She then suggested Lorca request His Majesty to craft a specialized weapon just for her. Perhaps installing such a weapon on her back might prove more effective than any combat technique. While Lorca wasn't entirely convinced, she kept this in her mind. Suddenly, a chubby pigeon flew towards the ship. Seeing the pigeon made her drool a little, thinking she might have an extra meal today. To her surprise, the pigeon flew straight to Ash's arm. It cooed a few times while chewing on the snacks, but Ashes seemed to understand every sound and then told her to report back to Tilly that they would be arriving soon. Watching the pigeon fly away, Lorca realizes that she is also a witch. Ashes tells her that Maisie has a similar ability to her. However, it was hard for Lorca to connect this cute and chubby pigeon to the large, fierce, terrifying beast that Ashes had once mentioned. Patting her shoulder, Ashes then tells her to get ready as they are about to arrive in Neverwinter. Not long after, the ship docked smoothly at the port. Civilians walking stopped and saluted the ship, while the soldiers saluted back. Lorca noticed children among the crowd too, but it seems like this is some sort of etiquette, but why? Ashes explained that this was a military salute. Initially, she didn't understand why it was necessary, even suspecting that Roland forced his people to do so, but she soon found out that she was wrong. Lorca asked if people saluted because the ship they were on was named after Roland. However, Ashes clarified that whenever a ship from the First Army docked, the citizens would always salute as it represented the safe return of family members who had gone on expeditions. Lorca thought for a while but didn't quite think that everyone who saluted the soldiers was a family member. Andrea approached and explained that all members of the First Army were from Neverwinter, meaning that most residents had family members in the army, and they could also be neighbors or close friends. For them, serving in the First Army was a matter of honor, and everyone celebrated the soldiers returning safely as if their own family members. Lorca's interest grew as she approached the castle. Despite the grandeur of the castle, she felt quite a bit of pressure. Soon, a guard approached her, informing her that the king had agreed to see her. For some reason, this made Lorca unexpectedly nervous. She followed a god punishment witch up the stairs and then into Roland's study. There, she was greeted by a young, handsome man with long hair, who wasn't wearing any jewelry, and holding a quill in his hand. This was the king? Or perhaps she should call him the legendary Great Chieftain. She had initially thought that Roland was supposed to be a wrinkly elderly man with gray hair and wearing a massive crown on his head. Seconds later, Roland was the first to speak, welcoming her to Neverwinter and introducing himself as Roland Wimbledon, the king of Grey Castle and their new chieftain. Lorca bowed to him, shaking her ears slightly and lowering her head as a gesture of respect on behalf of her father. However, she did not receive a response. She looked up only to find Roland staring intently at her ears, causing her heart to sink. Back in Iron Sand City, she knew people always talked behind her back about her appearance, but no one dared to say it in front of her, not only because she was the princess of the first clan but also how powerful she was. However, this place was not Iron Sand City. She was no longer the princess, and without the protection of her clan, could it be that this king? Before she finished her thought, she heard Roland ask with a curious tone whether her ears and her tail were all real. She held her anger and swept her hair aside to show that she only had 2 wolf ears, explaining that she couldn't retract her ears and tail, adding that while they might look strange, this is how she looks. She tells Roland that if it was necessary, she would avoid going into public, so she wouldn't startle people. She became even more upset, and felt out of place, a goddess typically seen as a symbol of strength and beauty by the Sand People, yet she was an outlier. However, Roland wasn't sure why is she saying all this, not quite understanding why she considered herself being weird. Lorca paused, caught off guard by Roland's words. He chuckled, saying that her features were not flaws but merely distinctive traits of her body. He even commented that he found her ears quite beautiful and expressed a wish to touch them, but he was quickly reminded by a voice that only he could hear telling him to not get ahead of himself. It was no other than Nightingale, who was hiding in the mist, to mind his words. This made Lorca blush. Clearly, this was the first time she heard someone calling her ears beautiful. How could a half-wolf, half-human be called beautiful? She wondered if Roland just saying this to make her feel better. Roland assured her that he would not impose any restrictions on her or want her to hide herself. He believed that with time, everyone would come to accept her. He even suggested having Soraya create a comic and make a play all about her to help people become more familiar with her more quickly. Lorca didn't understand a single word, but from his tone, it seemed like he was passionate about it. As the conversation shifted to the purpose of her visit, Lorca explained that she came to combat demons and hone her combat skills. She knew that there was a witch in Neverwinter who could heal any injury. She was prepared to confront any powerful foes and cover any necessary healing expenses herself. But before that, Roland invited her to join the Witches' Union, but Lorca preferred to go solo. She wanted to be treated like a mercenary. Yet, she wasn't telling the truth. She simply couldn't plead her allegiance so soon to someone she just met, especially when she was unsure if the king would keep the promises he had made to the Sand People. If not, then Roland will likely become her enemy. So she had to wait and see. Roland was slightly disappointed, however, because of that, he wouldn't be able to accept her request to operate as an independent mercenary. Hearing this, Lorca was surprised. No one should ever turn down a powerful mercenary, not to mention that she was offering herself for free. Roland then became very serious, explaining that they were engaged in a full-scale war, not just small skirmishes between clans. Lorca felt she was being looked down upon, wondering if the king was trying to say that the battles of her people were child's play. She was about to retort when Roland asked if she had already encountered Ashes. Lorca nodded while mentioning just how strong Ashes was. Roland tells her that Ashes was an extraordinary witch, and beyond this level, there were even more powerful witches who called themselves transcendent witches. These powerful transcendent witches had broken all physical limitations. Lorca was taken aback. Is it real that there are even more powerful witches than Ashes? What Roland said next made her shiver. There were 3 extremely powerful transcendent witches, dozens of extraordinary witches, and thousands of combat witches, and with all that, they still failed against the demon's onslaught. He hoped she could understand why he refused. No matter how powerful a single person might be, there was only so much they could achieve alone. Looking her in the eyes, he spoke earnestly, emphasizing that more importantly, he did not want her to throw her life away. Moments later, standing bewildered on the bustling streets after leaving the castle, Lorca watched people hurriedly pass by, her experience entirely different from what she had anticipated. She had expected to meet the king, then be discriminated against and possibly marginalized, but after saying her intentions and offering herself as a mercenary for free, the king would then agree, since at the end of the day, who would turn down a powerful and free mercenary? She will then be offered a place to live on the outskirts with no one around, constantly being monitored, and lastly, start fighting against the so-called demons. But, clearly, none of this happened. For the first time, someone had complimented her ears as being beautiful, causing her cheeks to flush at the thought. She really wondered where her wolf ears were really attractive. Shaking off the surprise, Lorca took a deep breath. Although she had been declined to fight the demons, she was free to roam the city and she could take her time and gradually get to know other witches. After all, the king had mentioned she could join the Witches' Union anytime if she changed her mind. However, if the demons were truly as formidable as Roland said, why would he set up his royal capital here? Lorca clenched her fists, convinced that the demons couldn't be as powerful as rumored, and perhaps Roland's warning about not wanting her to throw her life away was more about bluffing than genuine concern. She brought plenty of gold with her, and she could stay here for a long time. At the thought of this, she grew more confident. Even without Roland's support, she will find a way to fight the demons anyway. Suddenly, her attention was caught by a signboard advertising chaos drinks, half price on first order. The name sounded intriguing, and despite the strangeness, the look of the shop piqued her curiosity enough to try it out. As Nightingale nibbled on dried fish, sitting at the table, she tells Roland that Lorca wasn't fully honest with him, particularly the reason she used when declining to join the Witches' Union. She suggested that Wendy should conduct another interview with Lorca. Roland, however, dismissed the idea, reasoning that such an interview was part of the procedure for applying to join the union. But Lorca had already refused. Moreover, Lorca's primary purpose for coming here was to fight demons, which she didn't lie about. The Witches' Union wouldn't force anyone to join, especially since it was Lorca's first visit. She being skeptical on her part was to be expected. Yet, Roland never voiced out his real regret. He found himself particularly captivated by Lorca's fluffy, twitching ears, and the times when she involuntary swaying of her tail. He wanted to pet her on the head really badly. And what he really wants to find out is if the end of the tail is really a sensitive spot. However, he had to restrain himself from pondering further. However, his expression betrayed some of his thoughts, which was noticed by Nightingale. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. It was Barif, informing Roland that representatives from the United Merchants Association wished to have a meeting.